and it's my honor and my pleasure to welcome you to the first live gathering of BookMania in 4 years. Can you believe we were last together in person in 2019? Today's something to celebrate, and while we are very grateful that we were able to bring you hybrid programming thanks to virtual forums such as Zoom, I, for one, and I'm sure all of you feel the same way, have learned a new appreciation for being in person and interacting with human beings who share a common love, the love of reading and the love of learning. I hope you will join me in thanking the Library Foundation of Martin County for funding this free festival and the Martin County Library System for bringing these amazing authors here to Martin County. Let's give them a round of applause, please. It is great to be back at Jensen Beach High School. We do have, yes, I'm so excited. I really am so excited. I hope you can feel that. I've been looking forward to this for so long. So now I'm ready to introduce our first panel. Our first panel is Florida Nonfiction. This panel is moderated by Peggy Chittum. Peggy and her husband have been to every continent except Antarctica. And I know a few people in here have been to Antarctica, so they could hook Peggy up. They love to travel. She has a national parks passport with many stamps in it. They love music, and they have season tickets to the Atlantic Classical Orchestra. And the Atlantic Classical Orchestra has very close ties to the library, and Peggy suggests that you check out the free concerts that are at the library from ACO. Peggy is addicted to the New York Times daily crossword puzzle. She enjoys cooking, baking, and dining out at our wonderful area restaurants. Peggy will introduce her authors, who are Clay Henderson and James Clark, but for now, please welcome Peggy Chittum.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here nice and early. And I can tell you, after reading the books by our two authors, Florida Literary Luminaries by Jim Clark, right here, and Forces of Nature by Clay Henderson, who is over here with the bow tie, you will be fascinated by what they have to say. Clay has been in positions where he's been the executive director of the Institute for Water and Environmental Resilience at Stetson University, from which he is now retired. But he's been active in Florida Nature Conservancy and preserving our lands for a long time. And I'll leave you to read most of the details of his biography in your program. But I do want to point out that he is the recipient of the National Public Service Award from the Nature Conservancy, which my husband and I are proud members of down here, and also the Bill Sadowski Memorial Award from the Environmental and Land Use section of the Florida Bar. So he's got quite a distinguished background. And since he now lives up in Virginia, I asked him, well, how did you get so involved in Florida issues? And he said he came by it naturally because he's a sixth-generation Floridian whose grandmother was born in a log cabin. You don't get more Florida than that. Jim Clark, on the other hand, is a distinguished senior lecturer at the University of Central Florida. He's written many histories of Florida and has been a journalist and has quite a distinguished writing career and is also the recipient of a number of journalistic awards. He's also quite the character, and as I told him when he asked me where his $5,000 check was that I was supposed to give him for doing this, that I could not stop interrupting my husband when I was reading his Florida Literary Luminaries book, because there are so many fascinating little factoids in here, things I did not know about Florida or writers connected with Florida. When I was first given this assignment, I thought, how could I bring these two seemingly unrelated subjects together? But as I began to read both of their books, There is so much crossover between what these two authors have to say. It's quite amazing. But I would like to start with a question for both Jim and for Clay, based on something that Jim wrote to me when we were corresponding before this. In an email, he said to me, "What fascinates me is that most people, particularly in your area," and he's talking about the Treasure Coast, "are from somewhere else. Back in the day, they took New York history or New Jersey history and don't know about Florida's rich history and the fantastic places around them. And since I'm a New Englander myself, I know that that's true, and that's probably true of a number of you in the audience, that you're not from here. So I thought that I would ask them a question to kick off things that bring in both of the aspects of what they're writing about. Case in point, my husband and I attend church in Tequeste, and we drive down Route 1, and in a few miles of each other, we pass the Nat Reed Nature Center, which used to be the Hobe Sound Nature Preserve, and we also pass Jonathan Dickinson State Park. People probably drive by those all the time and have no idea who either of those people are. So I'm going to ask them to tell us briefly why these places are named after these men, what they did to deserve that honor. So Jim, I'd like to start with you since Jonathan Dickinson is older.
Yeah. He probably knew Jonathan personally.
And I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan Dickinson. People don't realize the first international bestseller takes place right here in 1696. Jonathan Dickinson was the merchant from Philadelphia, a leading Quaker, and his ship wrecked over here. And he and his party walked up the coast. They were captured by the Hopi Indians and subjected to horrors. And when he got back finally to Philadelphia, several of them died, he wrote what became the first international bestseller that was translated into a number of languages, and also became the first of a genre which went into the 1880s, which was the Indian captive genre. Novels and true stories were written about people captured by the Indians, children raised by the Indians, things like that. So Jonathan Dickinson, I don't know why I'm doing that, is a very famous author. In fact, somebody mentioned his book is still for sale at the Elliott Museum.
And available at the Martin County Library System. So if you check it out for yourself.
I wonder if our books will still be around 300 years from now.
And Clay, I wanted to ask you about Nat Reed.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Who here knew Nat Reed? Okay, there are a few hands. All right, there are a few hands that went up. Nat's family developed Jupiter Island. They had a few dollars in their pocket. Nat went off to the Air Force, came back and said, wow, things are changing here in Florida, and got really interested involved in trying to think what he could do about protecting the environment. A guy down the road, Palm Beach, Claude Kirk, was first Republican in 100 years to be elected governor of Florida. He was a real character. And he calls Nat and said, you know, you want to do something about the environment? How about coming with me to Tallahassee? And so he agreed to go to Tallahassee to work for the sum of $1 a year. He didn't need the money. And was Florida's first environmental advisor at a time before there was even a Department of Environmental Regulation, any of that stuff. In that role, he played a key role in killing the jet port that would have just ruined the Everglades. The development or the protection of Biscayne Bay, Big Cypress National Preserve, helped kill the Cross Florida Barge Canal. Kirk only served one term, He was quite a flamboyant guy. He didn't have the popularity to get reelected. Nixon had become president. Nixon and Kirk were good buddies. Nixon called, "What can anything I can do for you?" He said, "Well, why don't you take Nat Reed to Washington?" And so Nat became the Assistant Secretary of Interior in 1970. And for those of us that in the environmental law business, or perhaps for years, this was the golden age. In that short period of time that Nat was there, Congress passed the Environmental Protection Act, created the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. And Nat was right in the middle of every piece of that, including the protection of the Alaska wilderness, which doubled the size of the national park system. So he was in the middle of all of that, came back to Florida, served several terms on the South Florida Water Management District, primarily working on Everglades issues, and worked all the way to the time of his death. I knew Nat very well. We worked on a lot of stuff together. He would sneak away to Canada, the only place he could get any rest, and that's where he would fish for salmon. As soon as he would cross the border and get a cell signal, he'd call me, "All right, what's going on? What are we going to do about this?" Well, on and on. It was kind of work that we did together. A few years back on his last trip, went up there, crossed over to Quebec to do a little bit of fishing. He caught this absolutely wonderful salmon that was like this big. The last picture in his camera is of Nat smiling, holding this salmon. And he says, "If I die today, it will have been a great life. It was a special day." And a few minutes later, he slipped, hit his head on a rock, and those were his last words. And if there was a Mount Rushmore of environmental icons in Florida, he would be one of them. And he's your local product. And everybody in the state of Florida that believes and supports and loves Florida's environment knows Martin County because of Nat Reed.
Yep, Jupiter Island native. So. Jim, I know that your specialty is history, and I know that you talk about newcomers not knowing much about it. What would you recommend a few titles for newcomers to help broaden their knowledge, other than your own books of Florida history, which I would recommend?
This is a good one here too, by the way, Jim.
Yes. Well, it goes without saying that these two books are
My book
on the
is
list.
easier to carry, though.
It's true.
A book that I think that's fiction, actually, that I think probably captures Florida best, and I will bet you he will agree with me, is a book called A Land Remembered.
Sure.
Have anybody read A Land Remembered?
Yeah.
Whoa.
There you go.
It probably captures it's a fiction, but probably captures the Florida better than any single book I have ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
That's an excellent recommendation. Clay, I know that you've worked in the later era of land conservation, but I was amazed when I read your book about what a role ladies' fashion played in kicking off Nature Conservancy here in Florida. It was actually the fad for feathers in women's hats that got things going. So could you talk about that a little, please?
Yeah, this is, we're now in Happy April Fool, everybody. So last month was Women's History Month. So I had a chance to answer this question a few times. Women played an important role in the early conservation movement. And of course, what's interesting about that is that they didn't have the right to vote at that time, but they still played this important role. In the late 1800s, the fashion craze was big long feathers in ladies' hats, particularly roseate spoonbills and egrets and herons. And in a 10-year period of time, 90% of the wading birds in Florida were killed. It happened in a blink of an eye. Teddy Roosevelt, on his way to Cuba and San Juan Hill in history, was stationed at Tampa Bay for a little while. And what he observed, it was just unbelievable to him, that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of dead birds heaped on the docks, being ready to be shipped back to New York for the fashion industry. So it was women who actually rebelled against this, realizing that it was women who was driving this market to kill off the birds. It was some grand dames in Massachusetts that first started the Massachusetts Audubon Society. Some of them came to Florida. Clara Domerich and Laura Mars, Mary Monroe were the founders of Florida Audubon Society in 1900. And they worked to pass laws to be able to stop that. We had no game wardens at the time, so the newly found Florida Audubon Society hired several wardens to go out and try to protect these rookeries. Two of them, Columbus McLeod and Guy Bradley, were murdered. They never found McLeod's body. Bradley, they found him, in his boat with a shot to his head. Last month, for the 75th, or December rather, the 75th anniversary of Everglades National Park, they named the new visitor center in Guy Bradley's honor. But then women didn't stop there. And just briefly, the Mayman Jennings was the first lady of Florida. Her husband was the governor. After they left the governor's mansion, she became the president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, and she worked to acquire Royal Palm Hammock. So when you go into Everglades National Park, that's what the first thing you do is go in that beautiful area of Everglades. This was the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs that made that happen. And so all of this, as I said before, took place before any of them had the right to vote. But they made a tremendous impact on Florida, protected the wading birds from being extinct, and we all owe them a great debt of gratitude.
It really kicked off the Nature Conservancy movement in Florida, so that was a real eye-opener for me. And talking about eye-openers, Jim, I got such a kick out of reading your book in Florida Luminaries. There were people that I really expected to be in here. Everybody read A Land Remembered, and people think of Carl Hayes and maybe Tim Dorsey if you're a fan of his. I happen to be, because when I read one of his books and he talks about sites around Florida, we'll go out and my husband and I will do a field trip to see what he's talked about in his book, which I think is really fun. But I know that there were surprises in here. I didn't associate Harriet Beecher Stowe or Robert Frost with Florida. We lived right down the street from his farm in Derry for years, and I never knew he was associated with Florida. Did you find any surprising things about Floridian writers when you were researching your book, Jim?
Yeah, I found, you're talking about Frost, kind of a tragic story. He first comes to Florida and buys a house in Gainesville and puts down a deposit. And he and his wife were staying in an apartment while they house hunted. And so they put down a deposit. They were getting ready to close on the house. And his wife fell down a flight of stairs and died. And after that, he didn't want any part of Gainesville. And so he moved to South Florida. He hated Key West. He couldn't stand Key West. And he ended up in Coral Gables. And I thought it was ironic that he was asked by John Kennedy to write a poem for Kennedy's inauguration in 1961. And Kennedy was in Palm Beach writing the inaugural, while Robert Frost was in Coral Gables writing the poem for the inauguration. But there all these people that you just don't associate with Florida, who lived in Key West, Tennessee Williams. In fact, Tennessee Williams, and I've never seen this movie. I don't know if anybody has, a movie called The Rose Tattoo. Oh, okay. Which won several Academy Awards, and it's set in Mississippi, but Tennessee Williams, who wrote it, insisted it be filmed in Key West. So lots of strange things that brought authors to Florida and really made it kind of a literary center.
It's true. I mean, I mentioned Tim Dorsey as being one of my favorites, but of course there Zora Neale Thurston, who's finally getting some recognition for her work up in Fort Pierce. There is her heritage trail that you can go and visit if you would like to. All of the contemporary writers, Ernest Hemingway, that's another person that I think of him with Cuba, but I don't really, and I think of him in Key West, but I didn't realize that he was in Key West at the time of the hurricane that destroyed Flagler's Railroad.
Yes, he was there when this horrendous hurricane came through in, 1935, and killed hundreds of people. And it struck mostly in the northern Keys, and it killed a number of workers working on the railroad who were government people, who were World War I veterans, who had been left over, frankly, from the bonus army. Some of them who couldn't quite fit in to society were hired for this. And one of the most scathing pieces Hemingway ever wrote was a magazine piece about how he blamed Roosevelt, but how the government had caused their deaths, that they didn't send a train, the weather forecasting was terrible, and let these hundreds of people die. And it's one of his most dramatic pieces, and very few people have read it.
I was only aware of the story because I'd read Les Standiford's The Last Train to
Yes.
Paradise, which
Excellent book.
it really goes into that whole background of how that whole fiasco happened.
I will tell one Hemingway story, and I will tell you two stories, and you can pick your version. And one is very famous, that while Hemingway was in Spain, his wife tore down the boxing rings he had arranged, built in the backyard, and installed a swimming pool. And when he came back, he was angry, and he yelled and screamed at her. And the story is that he threw a penny down and said, "Here, take my last penny." And if you go there, the penny is still in the concrete. Okay, that's version one. And version two is, while he was in Spain, his wife found out he was having an affair with Martha Gellhorn, who became his fourth wife, and in a fit of anger, she tore down his boxing ring in the backyard and built a swimming pool. So you can pick your version.
Just, we got to talk about Hemingway. Just one real quick. I've been to after he left Key West, he and Gellhorn moved to Havana, and I've been to his house, La Finca, outside Havana. What's interesting from a writer's point of view, I mean, he left it in a hurry after the Cuban Revolution, so it's exactly how he left it, with the magazines on the table. But there are 3,000 books in that house. And he was a voracious reader, as you can imagine. Every one of those books is all marked up with all kinds of notes and interlineation. And there are scholars now from Harvard that are poring over those books to try to get, inside of his head. What was he thinking, and how did this contribute to his work?
Amazing, yeah.
Well, I had a chance to chat a little bit more with Clay yesterday because Jim's GPS system did him wrong on trying to arrive here yesterday. Yeah, East Ocean doesn't exist on his GPS, so who knows? But I asked Clay, if he could tell me what his favorite conservation spot in all of Florida, what was his favorite park or preserve? Because Florida has a very highly rated, if not the most highly rated, state park system in the entire country. You have no idea how fortunate you are to live here in many ways. And Clay said, well, that's like asking who my favorite child is. So, Clay, I'll ask you to talk about a few of your favorite spots here in Florida.
And these are possibly places you've never been to or maybe not even heard of. One that I would say is kind of like my children in my own backyard, Spruce Creek Preserve. I worked on that one for 25 years. Now, that's how many marriages have lasted past that, we had to piece it together just a little bit at a time. They're 1,000-year-old Indian mounds that are on the site where early colonial attempts were there for the Turnbull. It was fascinating. But that one I worked on the longest. One that I did not work on that I'm still in awe of is Fakahatchee Strand. And I feel a kinship to it. First of all, Fakahatchee is in the western part of the Everglades. It is a true swamp. It is like the Amazon in terms of where the royal palms, we take the royal palms here for granted. This is the one place where they grow wild and naturally. There was a book written about the orchid thief that was made into a movie adaptation, if that rings a bell with anybody. We had a hurricane hit a few years back, direct hit over there, lots of flooding. We were at Corkscrew, and I said, you know what, this is going to be a chance. Let's go panther hunting. And we went down into Fakahatchee Strand, and there was an old tram road where they brought the cypress out, and it's the only high spot for miles and miles around. And we navigated down this tram road around 10 and 12-foot alligators who wouldn't get out of the way. And we just kept going, and then bam, we knew it happened. Cats are cats. Cats hate water. And so the panther was out on the road. This was a real panther, not a UFO. And just walked along. He kept looking back behind me. I got pictures of him. I got out of the car to take pictures. He jumped back in the water. He didn't like the water, jumped back out on the thing. So we got really, really good looks at him. And that's one of just the magical moments, that I've had. But Fakahatchee Strand, it's protected, is the largest state park in Florida because of the obsession of a guy named Mel Finn, who was a lawyer in Miami who hated practicing law, fell in love with the orchids at Fakahatchee, was one of the founders of the Nature Conservancy in Florida, and spent his life trying to protect that, and it's now Florida's largest state park. Last place that probably no one's been to or heard of, about 400 miles from here is Topsail Hill State Preserve. It's called Topsail because the pure white sand dunes are so tall that from 10 miles out at sea, it would look like the tops of sailboats. And when I was a kid in the Panhandle, we'd stop at the grocery store and we'd get a couple of big boxes and we'd turn them into sleds, and we could sled down those that were so big. So the last time I was there was with two of my buddies who have now since passed. John Hankinson maybe protected about 300,000 acres of Florida. His last assignment was doing restoration work after Deepwater Horizon. But the other one of my heroes, and the heroes in the book, is George Wilson. George Wilson protected over 1.5 million acres in Florida, working for the Nature Conservancy. That beach, Topsail Preserve, had been purchased by some developers. They were charged with fraud. They went belly up. The property ended up, having to be sold on the courthouse steps of a little sleepy town called Defuniak Springs. And George Wilson bought that beautiful beach, the most beautiful beach in Florida, on the courthouse steps in a foreclosure sale. And now every year when the who's put out the best beaches in the world, what they call Great Island State Beach and Topsail Hill State Preserve is always on that list as one of the best beaches in the world.
That's amazing when you think about it. I thought you were also possibly going to mention the oak preserve that John Quincy Adams started. I mean, going way, way back in Florida history.
Well, I can do that because I'll give credit to Jim. Jim wrote a story for Florida Magazine, I think about 30 years ago, called Florida's First Environmentalist, and it was about John Quincy Adams. Think about that. And what he did is that he protected about a 5,000-acre parcel near Pensacola, near the brand new Pensacola Naval Air Station, or naval base then, because it had the largest stand of white oak and live oak, which at that time everyone understood was impenetrable to cannonballs. If you go to Boston Harbor and you see USS Constitution, the oldest ship in the United States Navy, called Old Ironsides because the cannonballs bounced off of it, it was made of wood from the panhandle of Florida, of this preserve. And it's now part of Gulf Islands National Seashore. I have visited it twice since it had direct hits from hurricanes. There may be a few limbs down, but they've withstood all those hurricanes for now over 200 years. Amazing place.
I grew up in the Boston area, and I cannot tell you how many times that I'd been aboard Old Ironsides. We used to go there all the time because my mother was a teacher, so we went everywhere. And I never, ever knew the Florida connection to Old Ironsides. So that was a big reveal in the book for me. Now, I just got a question from one of our listeners that I was going to ask you, so I'll ask it for her, and I'll address it to you, Jim. What is your writing process? You're still an active academic, so how do you work that into your daily process?
Yeah, well, as I've gotten older, it's a much slower process, but if you love writing, and if any of you want to be writers, this is kind of the golden age of writing in terms of book publishers. There are the big five, but there are more small publishers than there have ever been because of technology. You can do limited runs. I have a book that came out in the 90s, and my son wanted a couple copies, and I didn't have them. And I called the publisher, and they said, well, we're out, but we're going back for another press run. And when it first came out, a second press run was 1,000 copies. And I said, wow, and I was flattered. And I said, how many copies? And they said 36. And so, kind of a downer, but it's fun to write. It's fun, especially in Florida. Clay and I have talked about this, that so many things have never been written about. So many of the stories you're hearing today you've never heard before. And so it's kind of a fun thing. But if you aspire to be a writer, you can publish your book online and have it sold through Amazon. So, this is just a great time to be writing.
Thank you very much, Jim. Clay, I'm going to address this one to you. What is the biggest environmental threat that Florida faces?
Oh, gosh.
And who is at the forefront?
Yeah, I mean, we're at a historic juncture right now. Florida is now growing at the fastest rate that it has ever grown. When I was born, Florida had 3.7 million people. The population of the state now is 6 times that. So I've watched that happen in my lifetime. Talking to some of you yesterday and last night, talking about changes you've seen here in Martin County in 20 years. It's just extraordinary. Everything is driven by this rate of growth. Our stress on the water supplies, fresh water supplies, overcrowding, the pollution issues, the things you've witnessed here, the algae blooms in River Lagoon, result of a lot of runoff. We've got 250,000 septic tanks all up and down the Indian River Lagoon. The biggest threat to wildlife in this state is loss of habitat. Every year, we're bulldozing about 100,000 acres of land. And you see it. There's a nice forest or a nice marsh, and they clear cut everything, put in the cookie cutter houses, and bring in exotic vegetation and call it landscaping. So it drives everything else. And so when you couple that with everybody wanting to live on the coast, sea level rise, climate change, the incredible intensity of hurricanes that we've seen in the last few years, are all compounded by this. Who is in the forefront? I mean, we've got some outstanding conservation organizations in the state. I mentioned both Nature Conservancy and Florida Audubon Society are very much involved in this. State government, runs kind of hot and gold. We talk a lot in the book about land conservation. It's generally been a nonpartisan issue. We've had both strong support from Democrat and Republican governors for land conservation, but the legislature has just really been, just frankly behind the eight ball the last few years. They far more interested in making it easier to develop than to conserve what we need to. So next time you see a legislator out there, feel free to bend their ear and say we got to get back to doing a little bit more to protect this special place that we love.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is how uneven it is around the state. We have 67 counties, and some have adopted really strong pro-environmental plans, and others have said, come on in and just turn their county over to developers, which they're going to rue one day.
The next question I'm going to address to both of you. What is the most shocking thing that you discovered during research for your books?
We think, sort of like, how bad could it be? And you've been down to Miami. Miami's a beautiful city. Biscayne National Park is just a gem. The beauty of that bay. But what could have been? Just think about this. What could have been? There were people who had bought up all the islands in Biscayne Bay and wanted to turn them all into another Fisher Island. And then there was a guy who at that moment in time was the richest person in the world, number one on the Fortune 500 list. And he wanted to turn Biscayne Bay into the hemisphere's largest oil refinery and deep water oil port. He wanted to be able to move oil and gas out of Biscayne Bay to service the entire Western Hemisphere. And no surprise, the Dade County Commission thought this was the greatest idea they could be. But a couple things happened. There were some women that got involved, like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and Juanita Green. There were some fishermen who said, we can't do this, and we've got to put a stop to it. And then there's a great story that Ken Burns and his story on the national parks unearthed. That's just a wonderful story. Lancelot Jones, his father was an enslaved person who moved to Florida after the Civil War. They homesteaded this island in Biscayne Bay, and they needed to basically buy the island and bulldoze it to be able to put in the oil refinery. And the richest man in the world offered them gazillions and gazillions of dollars to make this happen. And Lancelot, who at this point was a fishing guide, said, no, we're not selling. And he was such a good fishing guide that people that you've heard of, like Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, even Herbert Hoover, all like to go fish with Lancelot Jones. And so he would whisper in their ear, don't you think this needs to be a national park? Well, today it is. And the first person to sell the property to the federal government for a national park was Lancelot Jones. And if you ever visit the visitor center, you go down a road called Lancelot Jones Way.
It's amazing.
I think the biggest shock I had was a story out of Pensacola that there was a man from Boston who was a ship's captain, and he went between Pensacola and Boston. And once when he was in Pensacola, some slaves approached him and said, "Hey, can you sneak us out and get us to freedom?" And he said, "Okay." And so they got in the boat and a big ship and sailed, and the ship was becalmed. There was no breeze, and so it stopped in the Gulf, and the slave catchers caught up with him, and he was charged federally with slave stealing. And this is a federal court ordered by a federal judge. His punishment was that his hand was branded with an S, with a hot iron, for slave stealer. That this was the punishment in Florida, to have your hand branded. And it became a poem by Longfellow, and swept the North even before Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom, and was one of the rallying cries beginning in the 1840s for anti-slavery.
Which, again, is an amazing story.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more question. And again, I'll address it to both of you. What is your favorite book to read, just for pleasure? Jim, do you look like you want to go first?
Well, I already mentioned Smith's book, A Land Remembered. I don't read as much as I like to. We were talking at our table last night at dinner about our favorite authors. Rick Atkinson has written a bunch of World War II books, and those are great if you've never read his trilogy, and he's now doing American Revolution books. There are just so many great books out there. It's hard. And again, there's so many books set in Florida that you would love to read. Hemingway's, To Have and Have Not is set in the Florida Keys. And people who wrote books, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote Tender is the Night in St. Pete Beach. So lots of books out there about Florida and written in Florida. Blake?
I go back all the time to two books that made a great impact. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Everglades River of Grass, 1947. It's what helped bring about Everglades National Park. It's an incredible poetic style, but it's also a history book. And she had great access to the Native Americans, Seminoles, and learned a lot of stories and wrote down things that had not been written down before. And it's a great book, obviously still in print. And the other one I keep going back to is William Bartram, 1773. I actually have a second edition printed in London because it is an accurate snapshot of the flora and fauna and wildlife and native people who lived here at that time. And as we try to redesign, rewild, manage these conservation lands to what it was like before we impacted them, we need to know exactly what was here before, and so it becomes a great roadmap for that. So there are not too many 250-year-old books about Florida that are still in print, but that's one of them.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think people don't realize what Florida was like, and Audubon and Bartram both write about this, and I have hard times imagining this. I think it's Audubon who writes about the sky turning black with birds. Millions of birds would block out the sun. And those of you, I don't know if anybody ever seen the Miami River. It's not much to see anymore. It's kind of a sludge area. But it once had rapids. Like you would find in Colorado or western North Carolina. You could, shoot the rapids. And now it's nothing. So we've already lost so much here.
Well, our time is almost up, and I just wanted to say that I think that an author has done his or her job if he or she impels the reader to go out and learn more about what they've read, to see something, cook something if it's a cookbook, to visit places, to learn more about the writer himself. And I think the two of you have succeeded admirably in both of your books, because my to-read list has grown enormously. And I now have a much longer list of places that I want to go and visit. I've already been on to my husband about making reservations for a state park that's up in the north part of the state, because I haven't been there. And I think that you two have just done a wonderful job of stimulating it, and I hope you've done that for the audience today. Thank you very much for being with us.
And now it's time for our next panel, Thriller and Suspense, moderated by Amanda Brack. Amanda is a career bookseller with over 20 years of bookstore experience. In addition to what you can read about her in the program, here are a few fun facts that are not in her bio. Amanda's favorite bookstore memory is helping Mr. Fred Rogers find a book. She took up a new hobby after retiring in 2021, roller skating, and she's not apparently injured. You're apparently doing very well with that. Her daughter is named after two fictional book characters. I'm dying to know which two. But please welcome Amanda to the stage along with her authors, Alex Finlay, Mary Kubica. Did I say that right, Mary? I was so scared I was going to screw that up as a Southerner. And Megan Miranda. Please give them a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much, Sue. My daughter's name is Samantha Temperance. If anyone can guess the book characters, that would be pretty impressive. I guess the temperance part is a little bit easy. So I would like to say, yes, it's so wonderful to be back in person for BookMania and see everyone here. I want to take a moment just to say some thank yous as well. Obviously, the Library Foundation in Martin County does great work. If you aren't already a member or you haven't donated to them, please take a look and do that, because they do some really, really great programs in the community. I wanted to thank Jensen Beach High School for allowing us back to do this program again. We've been gone for 3 years, so it's really nice to be back here. Thank you to Barnes & Noble for being on site selling books so that you can purchase the books from our wonderful authors today. And a thank you to Jeanette Noe of the Martin County Library System. She is the lady that really behind the scenes works for months to put together the author panels and everything so that it brings you what you see for BookMania and these great panels. So thank you to Jeanette. So yes, as Sue said, I am Amanda Brack. I am your moderator for Thriller Suspense, and I have with me today Megan Miranda. Yes, I love Megan. Mary Kubica, I verified, and Alex Finlay. So as we get started, I do want to give a little bit of a reminder. We will take audience questions during the last 15 minutes, which can be really fun. So as we're going through some of our talk today, if you have a question that pops up, please go ahead and write down the question for us, and the ladies and gentlemen in blue will collect those and bring them up for us. So let's talk about some crime. So for each of you, and I guess let's start with you, Megan. What did you do before you were an author? How long have you been writing? And did your experience prior to being an author impact how your books are written today?
Yeah, I love that question because I feel like you can ask a room of like 100 authors and you're going to get like 100 different answers. Everyone has such an interesting path. So writing for me was my third career. I started in biotech, and then I was a high school science teacher before becoming a full-time writer. But writing was always my passion. I was a huge mystery and suspense reader growing up. That's been like the one constant throughout all of my careers. but I also loved science, and I decided to pursue that first, hoping to still write on the side. But the truth is I let it go for about a decade. But when I started writing, I feel like all of these different careers influenced the types of books I wrote. I started in young adult fiction, and I was teaching high school, and they were all based on this like what if science idea that had kind of sparked the inspiration for these books that were a little bit paranormal. And so I wrote 7 young adult books, and then writing those books kind of gave rise to writing my adult suspense, because I was thinking about these characters who'd been through these huge things in the past. And then at the end of the book, you know, they're 17 years old, and you think, okay, well, I hope they're okay now, and like gonna go about the rest of their lives. And years later, I would think about them and wonder, like, how are they doing? Like, do they try and leave the past behind? Does it influence who they become? You know, does the past ultimately catch up with them? Dun, 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 because we're the crime writers. So that is pretty much the type of book I write now. It's really about how the past impacts the present and these big events that had happened in the past that then ultimately come back to haunt them.
Great.
So I was a high school history teacher before I started writing, and writing for me was just one of those pastimes that I picked up when I was a young girl. I always loved to read, and I was probably middle school, maybe elementary school when I started writing. And I knew that I loved it right away. You know, I would love to come home after school, and we had an electric typewriter back in the day, and so plug in the typewriter and work on whatever story I had going on at the time. But I was always very private about my writing. Like it never crossed my mind, at the time at least, that I would ever want to be an author, that I would want to put my work out there for somebody else to read. It was just, I love to create these fictional characters and worlds and sort of live vicariously through these characters. So I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher, though. That, at the time was kind of my greatest passion. And but again, I was always writing. When I was in school myself, when I was in college, even when I started teaching, I was always writing whenever I had some free time. And then when my daughter was born, she's 17 now, so this was back in 2005. That was when I left teaching for what I thought was temporarily to raise my family, and it was then that I started really pursuing my writing and thought about, seeing if I could get something published and making a career out of it. So it was definitely a second career for me. But I think that teaching high school kids just sort of allowed me to just constantly observe people, human nature, and just, I can't say that anything, that happened inside the classroom is like a direct inspiration for anything that's in my books. But I think that I've always just been observant of people, and I do so now if I'm writing at a coffee shop or I'm at the airport. I'm always just watching people and overhearing these conversations and seeing what can kind of add. So be careful what you say around me. Seeing what can kind of I can bring it to my books and things like that.
Yes, I have been a lawyer for nearly 30 years, and so that definitely influenced my fiction writing. I'm an appellate lawyer, and that's basically a paper fight, and a case comes to me after it's been through the ringer of the civil or criminal justice system, and you basically get this mass of this stuff that happened, and my job is to condense it down and tell my client's story in a way that's compelling to a judge. And so all of those things I think were good training ground for me. Judges have just stacks and stacks of legal briefs, and I learned early in my career, if you want them to pay attention to yours, you better make that brief interesting, you better make it move along fast, and you better keep it as brief as you can. And for thrillers, that kind of helps. I want the readers to turn the page. I always strive in my novels, like I do in my law career, which is to say as much as I can with as few words as possible. And with fiction, you can do that. And the great thing about this job is I can just give a reader a detail, if it's just the right detail, and they fill in the rest with their imaginations. And so for every person who reads one of my books, it's kind of this interaction between me and them. And it really goes back to keeping things lean. And so that part, and the other part of being a lawyer is when I write a legal brief, the first thing that in a legal brief you have is the facts section, which is what happened, and then you have the law. My goal has been that facts section, by the time the judge is done with it, they've already decided that my client's going to win. When they get to the law, that'll work itself out. And that's really, I learned to do that. You have to learn about storytelling. And so that's what I've integrated into my work.
So Alex writes the most compelling appellate briefs in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, let's not get crazy. I don't think you're going to want to read them at your nightstand, but comparatively, by comparison.
Comparative, hey, that works. That's wonderful. So one of the things when you write crime fiction, or you're lumped into the category of mystery, thriller, and suspense, is that can be difficult for a customer or an audience member to really gauge, is this book going to be something I'm going to be safe picking up? Am I going to read something that's going to be like, oh no, I'm going to have nightmares now? So will each of you give me an idea of where your books kind of rank on a drama, suspense, or even gore scale? Maybe from like Nancy Drew and the Clue Crew to like the kids from It chasing down an interstellar, child-eating demon. Whoever wants to go first, just to give the audience an idea of what type of thrillers you really write and what they will experience in there.
Yeah, I think I'd put mine somewhere in the middle of Nancy Drew and It. I definitely, I'm drawn to the psychology of the mysteries, the why someone did something, and so there is some gore, there are some trigger warnings for some of my books, but I would say I try not to make anything too gory. That doesn't interest me as much as just really getting inside somebody's mind and figuring out what motivates them to do the things that they do.
Yeah, I'd say very much similar for myself. I'm actually a huge chicken in real life. I can't watch scary movies. The jump scare is the thing that I have to have someone, there's movies I want to see, and someone has to basically walk me through the entire plot before I can go see it. So I'm really very much interested in the same, the psychological aspect. Even though I think my most recent book has a high body count in the past, they're not things you see on the page. It's more about the aftermath and working through what happened and why. So I'd say they're pretty much in the middle, very similar to Mary's.
Yeah, speaking of the jump scare, my wife the other night had a jump scare. She had a glass of wine in her hand and threw it, the whole thing across the window. So, just an aside.
Was she reading your book at the time?
I agree with everything that was said. I'm not a gore person. I think my books have crime and murder and all that. Just to be transparent about it. But I often find that it can be more spooky or frightening to what's not on the page. And things that happen off screen. My last book, The Night Shift, it opens, awful premise. It's a Blockbuster video store in 1999. All the teenage employees are attacked and only one of them survives. You don't see any of what happened. You see a couple kids go into the break room and not come out, and their teenage colleague goes to check on them, goes in there and sees two sets of legs on the floor, and then a light goes out. You didn't have to see anything there, what happened, for it to achieve the same purpose. And so I often will do things off screen, just as one, I don't particularly like to read gore myself, but it's also useful for suspense.
It's what you don't know, right? That's that suspense
Right,
element.
absolutely. I would agree. I think, even if someone doesn't read a lot of mystery and suspense, any of your novels are perfectly accessible. You're not going to run into any page where you're like, oh no, what just happened here? I didn't want to see that. So definitely great thrillers and psychological thrillers for that. So on that note, when you're at the heart of any of these mystery and thriller novels, there's going to be some kind of fateful event. So how do you find that hook? What happens that causes you to, that light bulb to go off and you say, okay, this is going to make a great story?
Well, I'm probably the worst to say because I never have a clear answer to this kind of where you get your idea or where did this come from. Occasionally, a book I'll be able to pinpoint it, but I think for me it's ideas can come from anywhere and often unexpected places. For the current book, it's called What Have We Done? I was reading a lot of Malcolm Gladwell, which he's a nonfiction writer. If you've read his work, he takes social science and he kind of combines it with profiles, and it's really storytelling, but he addresses really interesting questions about how we communicate with each other or what makes somebody successful. And so I was on a kick of reading all of his books, and he touches in some of them on this phenomena where sometimes the things that you think are going to hold somebody back, the trauma, the different things that happen to them, could be the catalyst for them to become really successful. And sometimes people who have every advantage in the world, at some point, you get a certain level of advantage and it starts to hurt you and make you less likely to be successful. And as part of that analysis, he said, he noted some studies have noticed that people who lost a parent at a young age, there's a disproportionate number of them who have really achieved. If you take U.S. presidents, about a third of them have lost a parent at a young age. And so that got the seed of this idea for my book, which is about a group of foster kids who lost their parents, who are at this kind of abusive foster home. And the place is shut down, they're the best of friends, and they go on to have these really accomplished lives. And then somebody shows up out of the blue trying to kill each one of them, and they have to reunite. But the genesis of that idea was this thing about what happens to us when we're younger, or losing a parent, or that type of thing, how it can affect us later. And all of my characters are they're really successful and they have interesting jobs, but they carry the baggage of what happened. And in the book, they have to go back and face that to, kind of determine who wants to kill them.
So a lot of times I talk about writers as either plotters or pantsers, and I think Megan and I are very similar in that we're both pantsers. In other words, we fly by the seat of our pants. We don't plot anything out. So whenever I get an idea, when it first comes to me, it's just like this tiny, tiny seed of an idea. It's not fully formed. Sometimes I don't know if it's going to have legs, and it takes time to start writing and developing that story to see if it's going to go anywhere. But usually it's just something, that maybe I either just, think up, or I see something on the news that inspires me, or I listen to some true crime podcasts, things like that, just some little bit of inspiration. And, I don't know at the starting point really who all my characters are going to be. I don't have any idea how the story is going to develop. I definitely don't know what my twist is going to be. But with my last book, just The Nicest Couple, the idea that first came to me was just the idea about a missing man. Because I feel like we hear so often in literature and in real life about missing women and missing wives. And so I started with that idea, wouldn't it be interesting to explore a story of a missing man and see if ultimately, the story is the same as when we hear about missing women, or if there's something different, if it develops differently. So that was it. It was just kind of that spark of an idea. And I started writing, and little by little got to know my characters and saw where the idea led. But so it always just kind of comes as a little nugget.
Yeah. Very similar answer for myself. For the most part, I usually don't have the big high concept plot element at the start. It's something small that turns into something bigger, or it's two different ideas merge, or I see something on the news and it kind of triggers something else I'm thinking about. And usually it starts with a character, where it's a character who, and then the plot develops from there. I kind of write my way into the story. My most recent book, The Only Survivors, though, this is one I actually started with a plot point, and it was really unusual for me to actually have a plot before everything else. And it actually happened, I was on vacation with my family. We were visiting my husband's family in Puerto Rico, and my husband and daughter were walking along the beach, and a cell phone washed up at their feet in the surf. It just appeared. It was in one of those OtterBox cases, but it was cracked and it looked like it was dead. And they were like, well, let's bring it back to our condo and see if we can track down its owner. And I was like, well, this is a hopeless situation. We left it out in the sun. We came back at the end of the day, and my daughter had gotten back first. She's plugged it in and it turned on. And I was and she's, and there's no password screen. Where I'm that's crazy. That would never happen. And immediately they were well, this is exciting. We're going to track down the owner. And the crime writer in me was absolutely not. Clearly, this is evidence of a crime. And we have just turned on the phone, and now they can track us down. And they were why do you think that way? That's, but I guess it's useful when you're writing crime fiction, but not existing in daily life. But that is what my mind does. It takes a piece and just runs with it. And the story had a very happy ending where we did track down the owner. It was it took a long time, but they had lost it on vacation 2 weeks earlier, and it had survived somehow, which blew my mind. Sent it back to them, but in the back of my mind I was is this really the story? And I got home, and if you read The Only Survivors, this is a very small plot point, but it was the element that kind of, I was okay, so who's at the beach? What's this group of people? And in my case, I'm okay, it's not family, it's not friends, it's a group of classmates who've survived something tragic and come back together. And so my husband always jokes I take these our favorite places and then turn them creepy, so that's my brand. the beach creepy now. Yeah.
Yeah, she does a great job with the cell phone. I've gotten to read the book because I got to do the panel, so yeah, definitely the cell phone.
I think I see the cell phone guy out there watching me right now. Some guy was like,
I was also thinking you could kind of pitch that to that cell phone company because that would be a great story for a commercial,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Alex, I want to touch on that because didn't you turn a place creepy? You take your wife on a research.
well, there's so many ways I can go with that. I don't know which one you're referring to. I had a recent research trip where in the current book, the kids I talked about who grow up to be successful adults, one of them is a TV producer for a reality TV show. And I'm kind of lazy, like my buddy is the producer for this show called Gold Rush, so I just basically stole his job and kind of fictionalized it. But they follow these coal miners around. And so I wrote the book. As usual, I didn't do any research. I just wrote the thing, and then I always go back and have to fix things at the end. And I thought, coal mining, I go into this coal mine, stuff happens, and that's a tricky job and dangerous, and I should probably respect that and do the research on that, not do what I often do, which is just kind of fake my way through it. So I contacted the University of West Virginia, has this great coal mining safety program where they have this great mock mine, and they train people how to rescue people, and they do these simulations. But it was during the pandemic, and the only time they could get me in was on my 30th wedding anniversary. So you see where this is headed. And so there we go, my wife and I. It was pandemic, so we go to this small town. Nothing's open on the main street. I think we were the only people in the hotel. We had like cold Taco Bell for our anniversary dinner, which it wasn't nearly as romantic as I'm making it sound either. And so we go and we do the research trip, and it turned out well. But so that's I usually listen to the audiobook of my book right before it comes out, so I can refresh my memory. My wife and I were driving, listening to it, and I swear every time the coal mine scene comes on, her jaw clenches just a little bit, just a little.
So I expect your 35th anniversary, your book's going to take place near Paris.
If we get there, if she hasn't rethought the whole thing.
So you mentioned, writing a book in quarantine. How were you guys doing? Were any of your books conceptualized in quarantine? Did that incubate any of your ideas? Did it help? Did it hinder? Talk a little bit about that. Anyone that wants to, or not. We can move past it.
I wrote my book that just came out in January, Just the Nicest Couple. I wrote that during quarantine. I started it. It was like April of 2020. I started it, and it was a terrible experience. I'm not gonna lie. I had never dealt with writer's block like I dealt with that book, but I had two kids, at home doing virtual school for almost a year. My husband working from home for about a year, and I'm the kind of writer that I want quiet. I want to be alone when I write, and I couldn't find that anywhere, and the coffee shops were closed, just everything was closed, the library was closed, there was nowhere that I could go to get that quiet that I wanted so badly to write, and so I struggled, and it was just such a different experience than I had ever had before, especially I have to say coming off the book before, it was the easiest I think that I'd ever written, so on the heels of that, to then go into this book that, when I start, I always have to turn in a proposal to my editor, and I sent her so many, I lost count of how many proposals I sent her before the one for Just the Nicest Couple, and she liked them, she was on board, I'd start writing, and I'd get like a third of the way into a book just to realize I wasn't feeling it, I wasn't connecting with the story or the characters, and I'd set it aside and move on to the next one, and I think it was just, the time and the situation, I just couldn't connect with any of these stories. And in my whole life, I've never missed a deadline. I'm always that writer that's turning in my manuscripts like months before they're due. And I watched my deadline come and go with that book, and I was still spinning in circles. I had no idea what to do, and it was like 6 weeks past my deadline. And thankfully, I had a very understanding editor. But I was about 6 weeks past my deadline when I got the actual idea for Just the Nicest Couple. And, as soon as I started writing, I connected and I fell in love with those characters, and I knew that this was finally something that I could see all the way through, and I ended up writing a draft of it in just about 3 months. I think that once I finally got going, it was just such a relief to be able to write again and not feel so, just really be struggling as much. So it was great to get past that, and I've now turned in a draft of my next book, so it was so good to know that was a one-off and not predictive of my future. But so it was just a different experience than I never had before.
So not this book, but the book that I started right before lockdown was Such a Quiet Place, which is like a neighborhood thriller, and it became almost like a lockbox. Like it basically just takes place on this one street in the neighborhood. I started it, and then everything came to a grinding halt. I'm used to working at home, not used to everyone else being at home as well, and my kids doing homeschool right as. Luckily, they're teenagers; they're able to do a lot. But it was very hard, I think, to kind of get deep into this mindset of a fictional world with everything else that was happening. And I also blew that deadline. But when I got back to writing it, I think the themes, I think people who've read the book think that I conceptualized it during quarantine, because it is very much like you're not leaving your neighborhood. Like your neighbors are your whole world and everything is taking place there. So I feel like those themes pulled even tighter as I was writing it, and it came much more of a locked box. And then right after that, I started writing The Last to Vanish, which is set in the mountains of North Carolina. And it's about a series of people who've gone missing hiking. And that was again, one of the things my husband's you turn something fun that we do and turn it totally creepy. But it was the one thing that we were able to do was we could get out, we could go hiking, we could go walking. And I do feel like that very much inspired that book. And so even though it's not kind of pulling on those quarantine themes, it is inspired by, I think, what we were doing when we were first kind of emerging from it.
Yeah, I didn't need the pandemic to miss every deadline, but I'll use it if I can. So I had similar. I had when the pandemic broke, I had a senior in college who had to come back his last 3 months, and I don't know if you've had somebody who's been out not under your rules for 4 years. It's a real fun time. And then my daughter was a senior in high school. She was home, and I kind of capture this whole what all that was for me. And there's my favorite ever book dedication that I should figure out what author it is, but I saw it online or something. And the dedication goes like this: "Were it not for my wife and children, this book would have been done 2 years earlier." So, but as far as the process, I actually did have some block as well. I started writing as a lawyer, going from basically my commute from my house outside of DC to downtown DC. So I would write on the way there on my phone, and I would work all day, and then on the way home I would write on my phone. And then on the weekends, I would dump all of this ramblings of a madman into a document, and that's what I would sit down to start writing. For me, it was one, something about the movement, and two, having words on a page, even if they were terrible, was just something that got me motivated to sit down and do it. And the pandemic came, and I had no commute anymore, and I'm having this kind of block. And then I realized it's because I wasn't walking anymore, so I just had to recreate my commute, and I'd go on these 3-hour walks. I'd look up, I'd be in some neighborhood I've never been in DC, because I've just been walking, writing these first drafts. And to this day, I cannot write without walking. Even if it's cold out, I'm on a treadmill. It's weird. So.
That's so interesting. That's fun. Okay, so each of you also, in the mystery and thriller genre, so many authors have recurring characters, recurring worlds that they just build upon, and each of you have chosen to do standalone novels where you start from scratch each time. So talk a little bit about that choice, and are there any of the worlds or neighborhoods that you would like to go back and revisit that we might get a sequel to?
I love reading series, but I love writing standalone, and I feel like it's probably because of my process that I love to start with a character and discover what their world is, and that's kind of the most fun for me, is what are the relationships like? What secrets are kind of buried between these relationships? And part of the unraveling of the mystery as I'm writing, there's the external plot, but it's really about the secrets, I think, that are inside other people that are what really fascinate me. And before I see a plot arc, I'll usually see a character arc and where I hope they'll get to at the end. And at the end, you're like, okay, they've made it through all of these terrible, scary things that have happened to them. And I like to imagine that they're off like living their lives after that. And I do think about characters years later where I'm like, I wonder if there's a story here. But like, I'm a thriller writer, so I'd have to put them in like another terrible situation again. And my main characters are not police officers, they're not detectives, they're not people who would have like an investigative role normally, unless it's very much about like normal people who find themselves at the center of this mystery. And so I think because of that, I'm naturally drawn to writing a new cast and a new standalone each time. The only time I had done a companion, my very first book was a young adult book called Fracture. And 2 years later, I wrote a companion from a different character's point of view, and it was like 8 months later, but you could still kind of see like the same characters in it, so that was kind of fun. But then, because I'd never done it before, I was like, oh, you're so bound to everything you wrote before. Like, you can't go back. My editing process, like, everything changes dramatically as I go. So I think standalones are most suited for what I'm interested in my process.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to be totally honest, I think I have ruined all of my characters' lives so badly by the end of my books that I just have to let them go and let them move on. I'm the same. I had a detective in my very first book, The Good Girl, and sometimes I do think it would be fun to revisit that and have a totally different mystery, where the detective is involved, but the rest of the cast is totally different. So, it could be read as a standalone or they could go together. But I just, every time I go to start a new idea, I know that there would be some comfort, and I've talked to authors that write series about they already have their worlds, and they already have their characters, and they don't have to rebuild that from scratch. And I think that there would be some comfort in that. But there is something about that totally blank page, totally fresh ideas that always draws me to it, and just the idea of starting with nothing and getting to create it all again. So I don't know if I wouldn't say that I would never write a series, but I definitely think that I'm for the immediate future at least, drawn to standalones.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a hybrid because I did what Mary had mentioned. In my first book, Every Last Fear, there was one character, an FBI agent, and as I was working on the next book, that book came out, and readers kind of liked this character, and then the TV people wanted to do a show with her centered, and so I thought, being the hack I am, I thought I'm going to put her in the new book too, and so she reappears, but a totally different standalone story. And I really liked writing that character, and there was some comfort, like you said, going back to somebody you've worked with. But I agree. I don't think I could keep track of all, even just those 2 books, keeping track of things you did in the first book and making sure you're consistent is tricky. I don't know how Jack Reacher does it, 20 books later. I have no idea. And I like to, if I would write a series if I thought I could sustain one that I would be interested in keep writing, but I need to just go with what's interesting me at the time so I can, get what I need to do and get me in the chair and get me to write.
You guys are generating questions. This is nice. I have a couple more, and it's one of those nice things. It's something my husband is specific about, where he prefers books that are not long series. He likes to have that kind of closing at the end. And it's a really good point that you made, Megan, where you said that how many times do really bad things happen to your characters? So it completely makes sense taking that standalone type of novel when you create your characters that are fairly relatable, like normal people. So let's talk about creating your characters. How deep do you go in your character creation? Do you ever base them off of real people? What do you do the characters tend to come before the crime or the plot, or do they mold them, or does the crime mold the characters? A little bit of both. Who wants to start that one?
Yeah, I can start. I go with, I come up with the premise, and it's usually I write the prologue, and that's when I know that's the book, this is going to be the setup for the book. And then I ask myself, who would the natural people be involved in this setup, a victim or a family member or a FBI agent, whoever. And then I start kind of identifying who I think I want to tell this story. And I write multi-perspective, so my books tend to be, you follow one person, then you jump to another, then you jump to another, and it all comes together. But for me, it's as I go. I'll know about 20 pages into a character if that character has a voice, and if I want to keep writing that character. And once I get past that point, I get to know the character as I'm doing it. And then I kind of circle back about halfway through and start to do things. I have, friends who do really detailed, before they even start, they do these detailed character profiles, and they know what the character's favorite food is and their favorite music. I don't do that, but I do try and come back once I know the character and think about those things and weave in that kind of thing earlier on.
So I always start my books just with, I think, like a problem, something that needs to be solved. And then the characters come next. And like Alex, I always use multiple narrators. So the next thing, once I have that problem, I ask myself, who is going to tell this story? And I love telling them from multiple perspectives, because I think that as a reader, you just get, a more comprehensive view of the story. And I think that it adds to the suspense too, because not all those narrators might be telling you the same story, and you have to decide, who you can trust. So I ask myself who are going to be my narrators, and I almost always write from the first person point of view, because I feel like I can kind of become one with that narrator that much more, because characters are just so important to me. I think in a thriller you sort of have to find that balance between plot and characters, but it's important to me that you as a reader connect with the characters on some level. Like, you don't have to like them and you don't have to agree with everything that they're doing, but it's important that you see why they're doing the things that they're doing. So I work really hard on creating authentic characters. And then I do something that I don't think, it's kind of different. It always sounds messy when I describe it, but it actually makes it so much easier for me. It really simplifies the process. So I take just one of my narrators at a time, and I write his or her story from beginning to end. And then I jump back with one of the other narrators, and I write his or her whole story from beginning to end. And then I do that for however many narrators I have, and I take it, to the copy store and print out all these different documents, and sit at my kitchen table and start to shuffle it back together into a book. And so it sounds super messy, but that way I can just focus on one character, that one character's voice, so that I'm not bopping back and forth from chapter to chapter with character to character. So I'm just focused on that one person. A lot of times my books are not totally linear time-wise, so sometimes their plots are not exactly going together. So I can just keep everything that much more just really easier in my mind, because I'm just focusing on one period in time and one character's point of view. And it's always so fun then to put it all back together into one book and see how it reads. There are a lot of edits at the end. Like, it can be a super messy process, but it's really fun to put it together into one book and just see how it all goes back together.
Oh, can I just add one thing? Mary doesn't know this, but I heard her at a conference when I was working on Every Last Fear, and I was struggling with how to deal with a multi-perspective book, and I just basically stole your process. I wrote the whole chapter, and that's what I do now. I was on the airplane on the way here. I had all these different little pieces I was putting together, but I really attribute it to Mary, and I wanted to mention it because it was a light bulb moment. And you get these as a writer where somebody says something and you're struggling, and they're doing something that you think, okay, I'll give that a try, and that's the only way I do them now. So.
Oh, I'm so glad that worked. Yeah, it was one of those, I found it, or I figured it out, or I tried it. Really, it was out of necessity with one of my books, and there were just so many characters, and it wasn't linear, so I was different times, and I couldn't keep it all straight. And so I thought, I'm going to try it this way, and it worked. And so I'm so glad that you heard that and that worked for you, too.
I just had a light bulb moment over here, too. Like, I don't know if you saw, I was like, oh, that's how you do it. That's amazing. I'm fascinated by that. I generally write from one point of view. And I think it's because I'm naturally drawn, and I write in first person, I'm kind of naturally drawn to connecting, like Mary said, to a character. Even if I haven't had those experiences, I feel like if I can connect to an emotion, then I can write that character authentically. And I don't usually know enough about them before I start the book. Like Alex, I don't do a lot of I don't do a character sketch beforehand, but I try to know, maybe it's because we write crime, I try to know what they're afraid of. And maybe not the external plot, but what are you afraid that someone will discover about you? What are the things that you're trying to keep hidden about yourself? And I feel that the plot then almost develops in opposition to that, because your character is going to have to like come face to face with these things. And it helps me, so I feel like I can't develop one without the other. Like I could never have like, here's my plot idea, or I could never just have like, here's my character idea. Like they really come together to have to create a book. Usually it's character first. This last book I did have a little bit of plot first, which was different. And this book also is the first time I actually have, there's 7 survivors in this story, and it is narrated first person from one of the survivors' points of view, but there are flashback chapters from each of the survivors in third person, and they each give a little bit of like what happened in the past. And that probably would have been very helpful if I had like known this beforehand of like how to craft that. It's really a different thing, I think, to write like different characters' points of view. And also when I first started this book, I thought, well, my editor was like, do you think the whole thing should be in third person though? And I started it and I wrote about 50 pages and I was like, it's just not playing to my strengths of how I write and how I connect. And I threw it out and started again. And you just have to, I feel like everyone has a process and a way of connecting to characters. And mine is writing from that headspace and trying to immerse myself as much as I can into what they would do and why.
Beautiful. All right, well, we have about 15 to 20 minutes left, so let's segue into some audience questions. This one, pretty straightforward. Do you, for your audiobooks, get to personally pick your voice actors? Do you get a say in it? This person particularly loves the ones for Mary's books. So what does that process look like for your audiobooks?
Yeah, so my publisher will send me, for each of the narrators, they'll send me like 3 samples of work from audiobook narrators, and then I get to listen to those and choose from them. And it's always such a fun process because, you know, of course, like as the author, you have an idea in your head what these characters sound like. So you listen to these little snippets, and it's either like right on or it's totally wrong. And so I love doing that. I know my second to last book, Local Woman Missing, the audiobook, has done very well. Readers really, or listeners, I should say, really have enjoyed it. So for my last book, Just the Nicest Couple, I right away just asked for 2 of those narrators back because I knew that people were really happy with them. But as someone who listens to a lot of audiobooks myself, I mean, I know how important that narrator is. They can really, they totally change your experience with that book. And I hate to say it, but I've turned off an audiobook before because I just couldn't connect with the narrator. And it has nothing to do with the book itself. You know, I'll still go pick up a physical copy of the book, but I just know how important that is.
Yep, same here. I usually get a couple of samples sent. I was actually really excited this time because it's my first time having more than one narrator, which was so cool to be like, it's, you know, there's like a whole cast that you pick from. So that was a really fun process this time.
That is cool. Yeah. So what authors do you enjoy reading or listening to on audiobooks when you're not writing or, you know, during that kind of break time? Who are your favorites? Them. Okay, well, obviously.
A few of my, I mean, I'm actually listening to Alex's book right now in audio. But yes, these are 2 of my favorites to read and listen to. And some others, some of my long-term, I feel like my list is constantly growing because I love so much of character-driven psychological suspense, and there's just so many great books out there right now. Some of my longtime favorites, Tana French and the Dublin Murder Squad series, and Harlan Coben is another. I always look forward to Riley Sager's books every summer, and Wendy Walker, and I feel like I can go on and on. But,
Yeah, I think that my list would basically be the exact same as Megan's. You know, and we've all connected with so many authors, you know, through this process and just, you know, being on panels or going to festivals with other authors. And so then you're always, I think, eager to support your fellow authors that you get to know. But, you know, the same, I got a sneak peek of Riley Sager's book, which is out this summer, and it's absolutely phenomenal. I think it's his best yet. Wendy Walker, Kimberly McCreight. I read a lot of or listen to a lot of historical fiction too. I love Kristen Hanna is one of my ultimate favorites, and Pam Jenoff.
Yeah, I mean, to Mary's point, we know a lot of the people too, so if we leave somebody out, you always feel later like you're going to have an awkward moment with them at the next conference. I'm a big, you know, obviously Mary and Megan, and there's so many that my wife's a 2 audiobook person a week, so I get what she recommends after, because my time's more limited as I'm writing. But I also like to do things outside the genre. I loved Matthew McConaughey had his biography, which just having him read it, he's a great storyteller. I went in with very low expectations for some reason. I listen to a lot of biographies. I find people's lives kind of fascinating, and you often get little ideas for your books from things that have happened to other people.
Oh, right. I'm in charge here. Right, sorry. This one just came up, and it's actually a really fun question. Do you ever get creeped out from your own writing?
So I get creeped out from the research of my writing, and I think it's because, like I said, I'm a big chicken, and I feel like maybe that is why I'm drawn to writing crime fiction, because you're controlling it a little bit. Like I kind of I'm in control of the destiny of these characters a little bit. But when I'm doing the research, that is when I get really creeped out. So I was writing this young adult book, and I had pitched it as it's basically a home invasion story. I pitched it as The Science of Fear meets Panic Room. And so I was doing all this research on home invasion security protection. And then I'm home alone at night with my children. And I in this house that is built like a fortress, there's a panic room. And when I'm writing this book, I became convinced. I was obviously I need a panic room in my house. And my husband's I don't your neighbors are this close, I'm pretty sure they're gonna hear you help, that everyone's gonna hear you. As soon as I was finished with this book, I was oh, okay, no, I don't need a panic room. But the research gets into my head more than the writing itself.
Yeah, I totally agree. My last book, there's something happens in a forest preserve area down this path, and I'm a big runner, and it was actually modeled after a place where I like to go run. So and it was great for writing, and I could really describe it pretty well because it's somewhere that I go run pretty frequently. But now it's hard to go back, and not think of all these bad things that have happened here.
I don't get creeped out by my own writing. My daughter writes some really creepy short stories. When she was in high school, she had a creative writing class, and she'd write these kind of dark crime stories, and I was trying to encourage creativity and everything. And I'd say, but at the end, put a note to your teacher, that this isn't a cry for help, or your dad's a crime writer or anything. And so one night at dinner, she says, hey, Dad, I got an A on my short story. And I said, oh, you didn't let me read that one. And then she said, yeah, my teacher said it really stayed with her. I was all right. Next day, it was Monday, I got an email from the vice principal and a call from the counselor. So I tell her if she's ever a crime writer, it'll be a great story she can tell someday.
Please submit the psychological evaluation along with... So this is a great question, and I want to add my own little question with it. When writing a book, do you always add the big twist at the end? Do you know what it will be at the beginning? And my part of this is, how many twists are too many twists? Because I read one recently that had 6. I was okay, I just can't anymore. Do you know your twists?
I don't know my twists. They kind of come, and I wish I did. I heard an author recently say, I can't start the book unless I know the ending, because I need to know the destination. I wish that would happen to me. It just kind of comes as I go.
I don't know my twists either. I think that you need time, or I need time, I should say, to get to know the characters and their backstory and, what brought them to this point in time to sort of figure out what the twist is going to be. So there's excitement with that, but there's a lot of nerves too, because of course in the back of my mind I'm panicking, what if I never come up with a twist, or what if all these pieces never come together in some logical way? But so there's no greater feeling, I think, for me than when I do partway through, writing the manuscript, come up with that twist. It's such a huge relief, and it surprises me. I think that surprise is pretty authentic, and I hope that if I'm surprised by whatever these characters are up to, that you as the reader will be too. I think that there are so many incredible authors in this genre, and all the time they're getting more and more incredible authors writing amazing books, and so it is getting harder to fool readers. And so that's one of the things that's constantly in my mind. Well, what can I do differently when it comes to the twists? So I do play around with twists on twists. I don't know how many twists is too many, but sometimes when there's a couple twists, I think it's good, because if if a reader can figure out one or two, but they don't, get that other one, then they still feel satisfied, hopefully, when they get to the end of the book. But I have played around too with, maybe the twist doesn't come on page 350, but it comes on page 250. And how can we, just change it up a little bit, since it is a genre that's just exploding in popularity?
I also don't ever know my twist. I love that none of us do. I feel like one of the things about writing first person is it allows me, like, as I'm writing from this character, to be like, I don't know who did it. Any one of you could have done it. And to kind of channel that suspicion towards all the characters. And I like to play with the idea that everyone can have a motive, but what's the one that's, like, pushed, like, to actually do it? And that's the surprise, or that's the reveal. And I try to think of twists as more like reveals, that they're just information. And I don't think too much about, like, the really big one. It's more like the subtle ones along the way. I feel like everything is like a shift of understanding, either for the narrator or for the reader, and that it just, like, reframes what you thought you were reading. Sometimes, like Mary, like, sometimes I know them earlier. Sometimes I get halfway and I'm like, oh, I really hope that I figure out how this is going to come together at the end. Then I feel like I also channel that panic into my writing, and it helps with the suspense. I don't know. But I feel like so much of it is once I figure them out, then I go back and kind of lay all that groundwork. And you try, like, walking that line. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like that's one of the hardest part, is walking the line between, like, surprising but also laying the groundwork. Because I feel like once I put one thing in there, it's so obvious. And I have given everything away on page 13.
Right.
But I feel like I'm always building back in, because it's usually not for the reader.
Right. Well, and I think that makes it hard. Once we do figure out the twist, then we don't know. Is it obvious? Is a reader going to figure this out right away? And of course, that's where, first readers and editors and everybody comes in handy, somebody that doesn't know where it's going, and they can, put their feedback in. But I think that it's finding that balance between, you want a reader to be really sad. You want them to have that aha moment at the end, not totally like, well, this twist came from out of nowhere. You want them to feel satisfied at the end. So finding that balance is part of it.
Yeah, I heard a writer once say, the ending, or an editor say, the ending needs to be surprising but inevitable, and that's really hard to achieve. And we know it so well. We're trying to spread breadcrumbs throughout, and when do you put that one too many that the reader's like, I know who did this, and so it's really difficult. And the way my wife now, she won't read the books until I have a full draft, because then I can have her not know what the twist is, because if she reads it going in, or she's read little chapters, she doesn't have the perspective either. So that's kind of one of the early things I do is just wait, and I don't talk about the book as much as I used to, and she's happy about that too.
Perfect. So that gives kind of a good segue here for this question. So what is the timeline for how long your first drafts normally take, and how many times do you edit?
I'd say it depends for me, honestly. I do put out, on average, a book a year. And so I feel like my first drafts generally take 6 to 8 months before I get it to the point where I feel like, okay, this is ready to go to my editor. And because I don't do a lot of plotting up front, I inevitably do a lot of editing as I go, as I figure things out. So I feel like the first 3/4 of my book is much cleaner than the last quarter when I turn it in. But I'm very interested in structure and the way stories are told. And sometimes I get that right on the first try, and that makes it a much smoother process. And sometimes I don't, and that is a huge overhaul. The Last House Guest came out a year after it was supposed to, because I just couldn't figure out the right way to tell it. I started with 2 narrators, then it was 3, then there was a 4th, and then it came 1, and then there was 2 timelines. So that, for me, is the biggest hurdle, more than the story, is who's telling the story, why, and why are they telling it in this way? And so it's kind of hard to predict. Every time I'm like, I hope this is it. But I've gotten to the point where now I send usually the first 50 pages into my editor and my agent to make sure, like, is this working? Like, just to have, like, is this general structure working for everyone?
Yeah, I have a book out maybe like every 15 months. It used to be once a year, but it's slowed down just a little bit. And I would say I typically get through a draft in maybe 7 to 8 months. And for as much as I can, I do try and edit as I write, again, because I have like these different narrators and like different documents going on. There's that merging process, which can be a little messy, and there's some heavy edits, usually when I put it all back together into one manuscript. But it's you know, the actual, it's basically clean other than, you know, some of the plots and where they need to be moved around. But then I'll send it to my editor, and then she and I will go back and forth a couple times, probably over the next, you know, 3 to 4 months, something like that. And that's such a great process. One, for, you know, just her feedback, but also when she has the manuscript and I can't be working on it because I'm just waiting for her feedback, that time away from the manuscript is just, it's the best thing, because when I finally do get it back, I can look at it with fresh eyes and just this renewed energy, and I have new ideas that I hadn't thought of, you know, before I turned it into her.
We'll have to pause here because we are actually running out of time. So if we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. Please come see them in the signing line. I want to close with just a quick reminder from each of them, who they are, what your book is, and a little bit of, hey, what's it about, or why you should come by it. Start with you, Miss Megan.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much. This was wonderful, and thanks for the wonderful questions. So I write psychological suspense, usually based on something like, the one sentence pitch for most of my books is like, the past returns. And that's very much the case in The Only Survivors, which is about a group of former classmates who were the sole survivors of a tragic accident when they were in high school. And they get together every year on the anniversary at this house in the Outer Banks in order to keep one another safe, so they say. But their numbers have started to dwindle, and now they're down to 7, and one more has just gone missing.
Good. Yeah. I'm Mary Kubica, and like Megan, I write domestic suspense or psychological suspense. My books are all very domestic. So this one, Just the Nicest Couple, is my latest, and it's about a missing man and his wife's, desperate search to find him, but also about another couple, the woman in that marriage who was the last to actually see this man before he went missing. And so they are hiding some secrets that they're desperate not to let anybody else find. So while one woman is searching for her missing husband, another couple is desperate to prevent the truth from coming out.
Okay, my pitch, I've already mentioned what the book, What Have We Done, is about. And my thrillers tend to be, standalones, but they involve family and past coming back to haunt you type themes. And other pitch, I have 2 kids in college. Books are right over there.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you across the way.
I'm Sue Whittington. I'm really thrilled to be here today. The energy is so wonderful, and seeing all of you interact with the authors is fabulous, but hearing what the authors have to say about interacting with you all is even better. The Library Foundation of Martin County hosts the Kiplinger Literacy Award Luncheon every year. It's a premier event highlighting the power of reading and the entrepreneurial and philanthropic achievements of some of the most successful literary advocates in our area. This year, former Foundation Board Chair and well-known community philanthropist Noreen Fisher was honored, and believe me, that was well-deserved. I wanted to have Noreen stand up today and be recognized, but I think you'll find this interesting. She had already committed to a year-long volunteer gig at the Moorgate Library in Port Salerno, working with specific children. So she's out volunteering at the library right now instead of being here. So let's give her a round of applause. I told her she had to watch the video afterwards. Our next panel is Love, Friendship, and Ever Afters, moderated by Linda Weiksnar. Linda is an attorney, shareholder, and head of the Marital and Family Law Department at Curry Buchanan. Some fun facts about Linda. She's a fellow Rotarian, a graduate of Duke University and Georgetown Law School, a former Olympic torch carrier, and a founding member of Impact 100 Martin. Linda was honored as the Seroptimist International Woman of Distinction in Business in the year 2020. She loves to read and learn, and she's a masterful storyteller. So this next panel is going to be very interesting. Buckle up and welcome Linda to the stage with her authors, Ashley Poston, Elinor Lipman, and Jean Meltzer.
Oh, fantastic, we have water. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is my second time as a moderator, and I mention that only because one of the ladies that I'm going to introduce for you, her introduction comes from one of last year's panelists. First I'd like to introduce Ashley Poston, who is at the far end.
Hi, everyone.
Ashley Poston started writing when she was in middle school. She never stopped. She graduated from the University of South Carolina and went on to work in the publishing industry as both a social media coordinator and then a marketing designer, and now a full-time author, and we're very happy about that choice. Her young adult novels have appeared on the Indie Next list multiple times, have been featured in Teen Vogue, 17, Entertainment Weekly, Hypable, BuzzFeed, and in the Goodreads Choice Awards. Her first adult novel, The Dead Romantics, that we're talking about today, was Good Morning America's July Book Club pick, Barnes & Noble's fiction pick for July, an Amazon editor choice, and Cosmo named it one of the 60 best romantic books to warm you right up. When not writing, she plays Dungeons & Dragons and reads copious amounts of fanfic. She bides her time between New York and South Carolina and all the bookstores in between. One thing that you'll learn about her is that she lives in a small gray house with too many plants and never enough coffee, and this Friday she will welcome 2 new cats to her charming home.
So happy.
Our second author, Elinor Lipman, the lovely lady in the middle. Elinor's introduction was written by Kristen Harmel, who runs a group on Facebook where you can meet other authors. It's really pretty wonderful. And Kristen was one of our authors here last year. And of all the introductions I read about Elinor, I like this one the best, so I'm totally stealing it. Known for her keen wit, Elinor Lipman is a master of social satire and has written 16 books, including The Inn at Lake Divine, Rachel to the Rescue, Good Riddance, and one of Mary Kay Andrews' all-time favorite books, The Family Man. Her debut novel, Then She Found Me, was made into a movie starring Helen Hunt, Bette Midler, Colin Firth, and Matthew Broderick. You can still find it. A writing professor who has taught at Simmons, Smith, and Hampshire colleges, Elinor has been a fiction judge for the National Book Awards and has been on the literature panel for the National Endowment for the Arts. Today she's going to join us to discuss her latest novel, Ms. Demeanor. It was released in late January by Harper Perennial. Was chosen as the Barnes & Noble fiction pick for the month of January and has been called a complete and utter delight by Richard Russo and sexy and fun, breezy and engrossing by Tom Perrotta. The Chicago Tribune called her the last urbane romantic. Now, that's not from Kristen Harmel's. I found that somewhere else, but I just loved it so much that you don't hear the word urbane too much. So, and having now met Elinor and spent a little time with her, it's really just the perfect description. And Jean, here immediately to my right, has the unique distinction of being the world's only Emmy Award-winning, chronically ill and disabled rabbinical school dropout. That's a lot. It is this extraordinary background coupled with a firm belief in holding on to your joy and seeking out happy endings which forms the basis of her diverse work. She also has become an outspoken advocate for myalgic encephalomyelitis, a chronic fatigue syndrome. In 2012, she ended her rabbinical studies and spent many years homebound because of this disease. But today, Jean lives a thriving, chronically fabulous Jewish life in Virginia. She sees her challenges as part of a larger journey and is eager to share her stories with others. She's the author of the international best-selling book, The Matzah Ball, currently in development to be a feature film, and Mr. Perfect on Paper. Her third book, Kissing Kosher, will be available August 29th, 2023. So as you know, at the end, you'll have the opportunity to bring up some questions for our authors, so please think about them and have them ready for when it's time for you guys to get to question. But at first, I get to do the questioning. So ladies, having read each of your books, what strikes me first is that they're not just about your straight girl meets boy wedding bells ring. They're all about family, and not just nuclear family, but the family that you choose for yourself, and not just
upline and downline, mothers and daughters and children, but they're about the grandmothers and cousins and people that you meet along the way, and how those people all become part of your tapestry. So is this type of a chronicle something that you approach intentionally, or do they just come out that way? Ashley, let's start with you.
No, I start first, okay. For me, writing romance or love stories is about not only like falling in love with the person you're meant to be with, but also in love with your community, with your family, with your way of life, with your career, falling in love. For me, every story in existence is some sort of love story, right? Whether it's with someone else or like a love of like the author with a genre, or with like a love of crime, right? Which was like the last panel. So yeah, for me, when I go in writing a romance, I look at the relationships, and every relationship I view as a different kind of romance. Yeah, so that's how I do it. And I love writing about community and family and strong ties.
Elinor?
Well, I don't set out to do anything. I just sort of, write one sentence at a time. But I think what influences, I grew up in an exceedingly functional family. So I had devoted parents. They were older, in their 40s when they had me and my sister. So I think that comes in. And I think, I often write first-person narrator. And I think that I try not to do this, but I think I can say sort of about a particular character, maybe c'est moi. And so I am, I feel that I want to satisfy the reader. I'm not going to drown anyone's children in my books. So I would think
you drown them with love.
Yeah. So I feel that I am, and also there's, the great example of William Shakespeare. We're all, because I don't write romance, but it's considered romantic comedy, and that there's the great tradition of William Shakespeare. His comedies all end with a wedding, so nothing wrong with that.
And Jean, how do you approach it?
So we have a saying in the Jewish world, maybe this is in the outside the Jewish world too, which is, yeah, sure. When you marry a Jewish girl, you marry their family. And I think that speaks very much to sort of Jewish culture in our world. Our love stories, it's not just marrying each other, it's marrying the family, it's l'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. And you can't really write, in my mind, a Jewish romance from a Jewish worldview without including the Jewish community.
So now, Ashley, you don't have to go first this time, so you get a breather. Each of you has been described as quirky. How do you feel about that? Not you personally, sorry. Each of your books has been...
I'm glad you clarified that.
Sorry. And really not just the books that we're talking about today, but sort of the greater picture, including your back catalogs. The word quirky comes up a lot. And so, Ashley, what I hear about you is voicey and quirky, and Elinor, what I hear about you is the dialogue is so natural and it's quirky. And Jean, we hear about you that it's funny and it's true to life and it's quirky. So, but I don't think any of you started out saying, "Oh, I'm going to write a quirky book." So, when you see this, how do you feel about that?
I love quirky. I think quirky is another word for original. I think that it is saying that maybe slightly unexpected, and so I like it very much.
I think quirky is also a stand-in for comedic, because people don't want to be like, oh, this is like comedy. Oh, it's quirky, because quirky is lighthearted and fun. But I think they're synonymous to each other.
I like that. Thank you.
And I think for me, maybe you guys feel this way too. I feel like in my books, because of the intersectionality of identity with invisible disability and Judaism, sometimes because it's so unique, it feels quirky to people. But how we make it feel less unique is we just keep putting more of those types of stories out there. So we put stories with chronic illness out there. We put stories with mental health issues out there. We put Jewish stories out there. And then I think after a while, they won't be considered quirky anymore. They'll just be part of the canon.
So, Jean, I'm so glad you said it exactly that way, because your first book, The Matzo Ball, which was fantastic and funny, that woman, she's neurodivergent. She's got some illness going on, but this is not a spoiler. You'll read about this like in the first 5 pages of the book. She's a Jewish woman who loves Christmas, and she writes Christmas romance novels. And then in the second book, Dara she's got a chronic illness, but she's also, her Jewish heritage is right out there. And your third book that's coming out in August, she's got a chronic illness, and the Jewish heritage is really very much a part of the story. So is this something that you intend to make sort of the forefront of each of your novels?
Absolutely. I've been sick since I was 18 years old. I've been homebound for the last 10 years, and for 2 of those years, I was completely bedbound. My biggest event was a half-hour trip to the grocery store, maybe once every 2 months. As I like to say, if you think lockdown was bad, imagine that for 2 years. And one of the hardest parts about being diagnosed at 18 or being that sick was that I had no models for what life with chronic illness looked like. To this day, we don't see chronic illness on television and books and film. So for me, part of this missionhood of this place that I've been given to write these books is to not only provide models, but to be a voice for all the invisible, the millions missing that are sitting at home who don't have a voice for themselves. So I will continue advocating for the chronically ill, for the disabled, the chronically disabled, and for those with mental health challenges.
And you've talked that one of the very important things to you about that topic is changing the language, how we approach it, and not talking about chronic illness, because it's not a cold, it's not the sniffles, but sort of coming up with a language that really is much more descriptive. And I think your books work on that as well. And really, they're not normalizing illness, but they're making it sort of part of everyday life.
And that's the reality. What I tell people all the time is, when I talk about my day with chronic illness, I'm not being depressing. That is just my day. And so for these characters, I think it's really important to understand that it's not on a binary of health versus sickness. People with chronic illness, we learn to adapt to functioning at 30, 50, 70%. We don't get better, we don't get cured because we show up to something. We have just adapted to the model of living with an illness. But that means we can still do amazing things. I am married, I have books, I won an Emmy, I lived in Israel for 2 years. My life has been fuller in many ways because chronic illness taught me that my mortality young. And so for all the bad that chronic illness brings, it can bring a tremendous amount of good. So that also I want to put out there as a message of hope, that you can still have your happy ending even if you're sick.
And we're going to circle back around to this a little bit more, but Ashley, I wanted to ask you, you also sometimes have neurodivergent characters in your novels.
Yes,
and
I do.
of course, in the current one, she, again, not a spoiler, she speaks and sees ghosts. So
I wouldn't call that neurodivergent. But I do personally have an anxiety disorder, and I have chronic pain as well. A lot of my contemporaries do. A lot of authors do. It's kind of one reason why we all decided to be authors, is because it's stationary for a lot of what we do. And I think it's important to put that into my novels. I don't ever actually call out, my name is Florence Day and I have an anxiety disorder. It's never that prominent. It's more like, because I write first-person narratives, it's in how she talks and how she feels and how some of her paragraphs kind of spin out a little bit, kind of like how when you have an anxiety disorder, you sometimes do what we call turtling, which is you just spiral down out of control, and it's really hard to get out of that spiral. And I do put that into most of my narratives because I don't know how not to write without anxiety, because it is crippling sometimes, and it takes a lot to get up and to sit in front of a lot of people and to talk about my experiences.
So, Elinor, you have not written about anxiety disorders or anything like that, but you have written essays for Modern Love for the New York Times, specifically one that you wrote about your late husband and his life towards the end. And you wrote another one about sort of finding love again after. And the way you sort of describe moving through, and you've written essays there, you've got books of essays, not just the book we're talking about today, that talk about sort of moving through the grief process and how your son adjusted to you, meeting somebody new in life. And how does that, having gone through being widowed fairly young and then adjusting to life after that, how does that impact your writing?
Well, I found out when my husband, and I always mention this in public, he died of frontotemporal dementia, because there's always someone in the audience who knows someone who has that or might be dealing with it. But what I found that I was a great compartmentalizer, that I could just go to my office. I was working on a novel at the time, and that I was able to compartmentalize. I generally put the sad emotional things, those go into essays, and I feel a duty in the novel to just satisfy the reader and amuse the reader. And I don't try to be funny. I found that my just point of view, that I think I'm observing something sort of seriously, other people might actually find funny. So that's a very gratifying thing. But no, I can't really say anything very deep about that it's just, I put that into the essays.
So I see, and truly found a lot of information about each of the three of you on social media. So I know that, and we've probably all seen that over the last 20 years, everything's changed due to social media, and certainly publishing is no different. So with each of you being on various platforms, which do you like the least? Which would you be okay if it blipped out of existence tomorrow? And which do you like the best, and why? Jean, let's start with you.
Wow. Interesting question. So I'm not a huge fan of TikTok, just because as a Jewish, very out loud Jewish woman, there's a lot of anti-Semitism on there, and I've been the target of anti-Semitism on there. But I am not on TikTok, so they find my husband. So I'm not a huge fan of TikTok. I wish Instagram gave me more words, because I'm an author. But so I guess Facebook, I have a wonderful Facebook community, and every Shabbos I try to do a Shabbat post, and everybody sort of says Shabbat Shalom to each other and talks to each other, so we kind of have a little Facebook family there. So Facebook's my favorite, and I'd stay off TikTok. Or TikTok and Twitter, sorry, Twitter.
Elinor?
Well, I wish they didn't exist, because as an author, they make you, your publicist makes you do it. And it's funny you should say you would like more words, because I don't like the long Instagram messages, and I usually begin mine with, it says, like self-promotion alert that my new book is coming out, with a picture of it. And TikTok I don't do, though my character, I put her on TikTok in Ms. Demeanor, and of course I had to check with some young man who knew about TikTok. And Facebook, I do it out of obligation, but I don't want to read about, I'm at an age that people are writing about their colonoscopies and their polyps, and and I'm just not, it makes me cringe, and I wish that none of them existed. But I think I would say I like Instagram the best, because it's my briefest, and I'm not allowed to post pictures of my two grandsons, which I would really, they're 2 and 4, I would like to do that. So I would be happy if they disappeared, go back to the old days. Yeah.
Well, that is a hard act to follow, and I will tell you, if you liked Elinor's performance here today, you will see it again in Ms. Demeanor and several of her other books, because the dialogue is very similar. It's very natural, and I know Elinor doesn't intend to be funny, she says that, but it really is. The dialogue is hilarious.
How can
but
I follow
unintentionally
up a
so.
colonoscopy? How can I do that? You put me in a terrible position. Why didn't I go first? Regrets, they're happening. So I have I think social media is very nuanced, and I think it really all depends on like how you best fit in your community and like what you want out of a social platform. I personally don't do Facebook. I'm on Instagram the most, but that's only because that's where I have the most followers and that's where my reach is the biggest. Twitter is, going the way of Elon Musk, so that's going to be doing something. And TikTok, I think like from an author's perspective, especially a traditionally published author, TikTok's not really all that great for like an author platform. It's definitely a reader platform, and it should stay a reader platform. I think there are some spaces that authors really just shouldn't mess with, and shouldn't like insert themselves into conversations where like readers are talking to each other about your novel. And I think the same way about Goodreads and like Amazon. So yeah, that's my take.
So, talking about Goodreads and Amazon, do you read your reviews?
No.
No.
Only the 5-star ones. When I need a lift, a pick-me-up.
There was the exact minute when I stopped reading. It was a long time ago. It was one of my books called The Ladies' Man, and I was complaining to a good friend who was my first editor was Stacy Schiff, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Cleopatra. Her new book is Samuel Adams, but she was my editor when she was 25. And I remember saying to her that I read this not very nice review on Amazon of The Ladies' Man. She said, "You know what that's like?" And this was way back when Hillary Clinton was just the senator in New York. And she said, I was walking by and there was a parade and whatever the holiday was, and someone just held up a sign that said, "Go home, Hillary." So so that was all I needed. That was sort of, just the bad vibe of that. So I don't read them. But who needs that?
It was a parade that Hillary Clinton wasn't even at?
No, she was in it, but she was, a new senator, not nice. It isn't nice for anybody. Well, maybe nowadays I could think of someone. Yeah.
Well, I like that you read the 5-star reviews. That's
I'm honest.
only 5-star reviews, folks, if you want to.
I want
anybody to read your reviews.
Like reviews will come to you no matter what, even like trade reviews. I remember getting this blistering trade review from Kirkus back when it was like my first book ever. My second book, Heart of Iron. It was a YA duology, and the reviewer clearly did not like sci-fi and had a bone to pick with publishing. And the reviewer said, "This book is angst-ridden backstory and deeply regrettable prose." And I have that crocheted. I stitched that into a pillow, and I'm like, I will remember you for the rest of my life. So I don't need to see other reviews, because that's going to be the deepest, most terrible review I will ever get.
And another thing that promoted my non-reading of reviews is I remember reading and loving, and she won the National Book Award, or maybe Pulitzer, Alice McDermott's, was it Cousin Billy? Or does anyone remember the title of that book? So I thought, that is the greatest book. So I'll look at the Amazon reviews, because there's going to be I don't want to say, no, I won't say asshole in this. But
you just said it.
If that can get 2 or 3 stars from a crackpot, and then I found, maybe a separate piece, so I chose, 3 fabulous, perfect books, looked at their reviews and said, see, the world is filled with crackpot reviewers with a mean streak, and what do I care about those for?
And also like how people like, I'm sorry. How like people interpret a book is like different per person because you're going in with your own like lived experiences and your own like views of the world, and so every single person's like read of a book is different, no matter who you are. Like I can read the same book as you, and we will come out with two completely different experiences. Because of our lived experiences, and I always think about that whenever like I get tagged in an unwanted review or something. It's like, oh well, I guess something else is happening in your life, and you're not, and like you brought that to my novel because you know that's usually what happens is like the world around people like influences like how you read and what you read. So yeah.
Now, Ashley, you wrote something along those lines into the Geekerella series, where one of the characters talks about, why does everybody have to see the same symbolism in books? Why can't we just read books and get out of them what we get out of them, and they just sort of mean to us what they mean to us? Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because we have that, and this is going to sound like a weird conversation to have at dinner. We have that conversation at my dinner table a lot because my niece studies American literature, and I say, well, why does it have to be, that somebody in the Grapes of Wrath represents so-and-so, why can't they just, be a guy? Mm-hmm. So when you all write, do your characters intentionally represent things? When they eat a certain food, does it intentionally represent something? Or is it just a happy accident when it happens? Let's start. Ellen, okay. I'm going to start with Ashley.
No, Ashley. Oh, me. Oh, gosh. Okay. Whenever I put something intentional in a novel, you will know it's intentional. Like if I'm like, oh, she's just wearing a blue dress that day, and I never call attention to it again, she's just wearing a blue dress that day. So there is this really great middle grade author, Owen Colfer, who taught me a long time ago the rule of threes. And the rule of threes is that if something is called out 3 times, then it's important to the story. So that's what I've always like carried over into my writing, is if it's like called out 3 times, then it's important to the story. Otherwise, it's your mileage may vary.
I use food all the time to characterize people, and it all started when I was in in college, and I went home with my then college boyfriend to his mother's house, and there was another young couple. We were like 19, 20, and she served liver and onions.
Oh, delicious, really. Actually.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, which I happen to like liver, but I remember thinking that said something about her awareness or her hospitality, maybe. So in fact, I wrote an essay about this for Gourmet Magazine, but I definitely use food to mostly, if someone just wants hot dogs and beans, which I love, but then there are the, people who cook with ramps and, name another sophisticated food, creme fraiche. So, yes, so I use it. It's a lazy way to characterize people.
So for me, I think all my books are sort of filtered through the lens of Torah or our Bible. I don't think you can really write Jewish romance from a Jewish worldview without the stories of our peoplehood. And for me, again, I'm a rabbinical school dropout. In biblical tradition and biblical study tradition, in my tradition, we have something called Peshat and Drash. Peshat is like the simple layer of a book, and Drash is like the deeper meaning, the metaphors, the layers. I think for my books, there's a Peshat layer, and it's the fun, it's the shtick, it's the rom-com, it's the happy ending at the end. But there's absolutely always a deeper layer. There's metaphors, there's midrashic stories if you're Jewish. There is multitudes. So I absolutely, if you just walk away from my books with just having a great time, I'm happy as a rom-com writer. But if you take more, then I feel like then you get a little more.
So this is Jean's book, Mr. Perfect on Paper. So you have annotated things. I'm not reading to you, don't worry. Jean, in your book, in Mr. Perfect on Paper, your heroine has she does meet her Mr. Perfect on paper and then in real life. Again, not a spoiler. I mean, it's, but one of her most important relationships is with her grandmother. And so when I was reading it, I mean, that relationship really spoke to me because they're obviously very close. Her grandmother is old and they know she's dying, not a spoiler. But I love this relationship because she goes to see her every day. She brings her grandmother and her grandmother's friends their favorite food. And you just see the closeness. So to me, this is where, the theme for your panel, sort of comes to me, that it's not just the boy meets girl, it's these deeper relationships of family and tradition. How much of you is in Mr. Perfect on paper?
So quite a bit. So Mr. Perfect on Paper is an interfaith romance. I was a rabbinical student in my first year, went on a cruise, deeply committed to my faith. When plot twist, I fell in love with a non-Jewish man. And so I wanted to sort of reflect that in this story of what happens when you love your faith, but you love someone outside of your faith. And in terms of the relationship with Bubby, that is our Yiddish word for grandmother, and the Hollaback girls, the way my family was, I'm a third-generation American. I am the product of pogroms, so my family came over to escape pogroms. So I don't have like tons of cousins and all this stuff, but I had, growing up, a group of very fiery octogenarian grandmothers and their sisters. And to this day, if you go on a cruise out of Miami, you may meet a woman with that book or the matzo ball in their hands pushing it on you. And that will be one of my relatives. And so that is absolutely the inspiration of like being surrounded by these strong, fiery, older women. I mean, for me, they really shaped who I became. So I love putting that into my stories.
And Elinor, I want to ask you, first, of course, I love the title, being a lawyer. The title is what caught my eye even before I knew you were going to be one of the authors on my panel. And so your heroine is, she's a lawyer, she gets herself in a little trouble, and she is on home confinement. So I know you are not a lawyer and you are not on home confinement, but what of you has made it into this book?
Well, let's see. I think it's first-person narration and my character Jane. I think there's a lot of me, and just in terms of outlook, she's a little cynical, and let's see what else. But the cooking. I cook a lot, and she has a little side job in the book where she has a little catering within the building, which is how she meets another person wearing an ankle monitor in the building. So I haven't experienced that. But I would say what's probably the most about me in the building is I used my building. It's a Midtown Manhattan apartment building, and it starts off on what the character calls her proudest and newest amenity, which was the roof was made into a terrace, and that's our proudest and newest amenity in the building. So I would say one of the most is the residential aspect of the book. So that's not a very good answer, but I just write one sentence at a time, and I can't help kind of speaking in my own voice, I think.
And before we move on to Ashley, I do want to ask you, the first dish that she makes with the onions, is that a real recipe?
That is a real recipe. Boiled onions she makes on TikTok, kind of a little rebellion because her sister made her do it. Yes, I own the two cookbooks, and they were published. One is 1896 and the other was 1897. And the first one, Hood's Practical Cooks, ''S cookbook, was published in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is my hometown where I was born and raised. So yes, I own these two, and as you know, as a lawyer, the copyright has long been expired, so I could quote directly from them. And so I did that. But everyone asks if I've made these recipes. I made the bread pudding my whole life, yeah.
Do you have those cookbooks?
I have those cookbooks.
And is Great Aunt Margaret real? Who was the cook for the rich people?
Great Aunt Margaret is a character in Life with Father, the Clarence Day memoir, and it was a TV show, a movie, and a play. And I make up the fact that Margaret, who was the housekeeper in real life for the Day family, was a great aunt of my character. This is not a major plot point.
Okay, Ashley.
Oh boy.
How much of you is in this book?
That's a real good question.
Other than a small town in the South.
Okay, so it's about a small town in South Carolina called Marymount. I'm from a tiny bit bigger town called Lexington. But a lot of my love for my family is written in the book. My dad is my best friend, and I killed him off in this novel. So this is the second novel I've killed the father off, and so my dad is just like, are you trying to tell me something? And I'm like, no, father, I am not. But you do have good life insurance, right? So, my mom is a really big into ghost stories and hauntings, and so I know she always wanted me to write a ghost story, and so I finally found a story that I wanted to write with a ghost. And don't worry, it's a happy ending, so you don't have to worry about an unhappy ending with this book. But yeah, so I guess that part of me I wrote into it. Florence is not all that much like me, but her experiences in publishing, because she's an author and she's also a ghostwriter, is very similar to what I have experienced as well. So.
And one of the things that you and I talked about very briefly last night is you use the term in here, mediator, for a person who is able to see and speak with the dead. Mm-hmm. And that is a throwback to who?
That is a throwback to Meg Cabot's Mediator series, which I grew up with as a teenager, and I still have the first edition copies of those books at home, and I go back and I reread them sometimes. They're some of my favorite young adult novels ever.
Was she a big influence for you in wanting to become an author?
Actually, no. Diana Wynne Jones was my biggest influence. I love Diana Wynne Jones. I think that she was a scholar of her time. She should have been up there with Terry Pratchett, and her name should have been known as a really big name in fantasy. But her books just never really got the same appeal as the Terry Pratchetts of the world. So.
Elinor, I know that you found your voice when you took a writing class, and that professor had some very good advice for you through the years.
Yes, his name was Arthur Edelstein, and not a published writer, maybe a few short stories. But I kept taking various iterations and started as adult ed at Brandeis, and it cost me $40 for 10 weeks. So even though I almost chickened out the first night, I paid for it, and I had put in $40, so I went. And no, one of them, I'd say two best pieces of advice from Art. One of them was, prepare to write badly. So if you don't have an idea in your head or you don't feel inspired, write some words down, because maybe that'll lead to another sentence, and maybe the fifth paragraph will get you started. And another wonderful piece of advice from him was, sometimes the best form of revision is to start something new.
And
that is a whole mood.
Yeah.
That is a whole mood.
You've done that. Sometimes you have thrown away hundreds of pages.
Oh, I've thrown away. For Isabel's Bed, I had a whole other bad 125 pages, and I threw that out. And with The View from Penthouse B, yeah, so I don't have to go through everything. But it's very rare where I continue from where I start. So but I sort of have faith in the process to know that I don't know where I'm going, and I can be very unhappy with a chapter or the beginning. I'll fix it, but the process is, I'll make it better.
And one of the other things that you were quoted in an interview saying that one of your editors said to you after reading your book, "If I were going to buy her a gift, I wouldn't know what to get her." And how has that changed the way you write your characters?
That was just my agent before she submitted it to an editor. She had this wonderful, I thought, it really helped me, because I'm not good at description, or it doesn't come naturally. I have to force myself, like, what are they wearing? What do they look like? And my agent said if I had to buy April, the narrator, if I had to buy her a present, I wouldn't know what to get her. So I went back and I put on sort of like the dropped waist dresses that this same agent wore, and I gave her like her immigrant mother's furniture. And I don't do much, but that was very helpful. And then she submitted it to Stacy Schiff at Viking, and that began the beginning of a wonderful friendship.
And Gina, how do you flesh out your characters with, sort of a descriptive paragraph, or is it over time a development?
So I'm really lucky that my characters are kind of born like fully formed from my forehead. But for me, the most important part is sort of the outline. But I really do kind of have an idea of who my primary characters are when I start to sit down. So I'm maybe rare or very lucky that I sort of know who they are and I follow them on this journey.
Okay. And Ashley, how do your folks come into being?
Through a lot of drafts. I write a lot of different drafts of the exact same book over and over and over again. And that's how my characters kind of come into being. Like at first they're like this one name, and no, they do this next, and no, they're this. I'm like a dog chasing a squirrel, and I never catch the squirrel. And finally I settle on something that like feels good. And that's when I know that I have a draft that I can work with. And so then I go back and I flesh out the characters. But yeah, it's definitely always a moving target for me, because as I write, I find out who the characters are. I find out what they like to eat, like who they love. And that's a really important process to me. But that also means the first draft is just complete trash. Just toss it.
You do catch the squirrel.
I do, thank you, but like tenderly, I tenderly catch it and then I set it free again.
And so for each of you, do you ever find that you have put, an act in the beginning of the book, an event that needs to move later, or is later that has to happen earlier, and how do you make those decisions to move those things around?
So I think I am a little different than you guys. So I was trained originally as a screenwriter at NYU. So I am a real classicist when it comes to storytelling and the 3-act structure. So for me, I always start with an outline, and I always know like my beats. That's the screenwriting term we would use for the beginning, middle, and end. So when I write my first draft, it's a pretty clean draft, and then I just go through draft. I do what you do, and I keep writing until I get to a point where I'm happy with it. But it doesn't veer too much from that original outline, that 10-page outline I do before every book.
And Elinor, you don't outline at all.
I don't outline at all. I think it's just laziness. I think that would take a lot of time to figure this book out. So I cut a lot. I cut too much probably, but I keep a document, and it's sort of the graveyard of paragraphs and whole chapters.
Oh yeah, I do that too.
Yeah, that I cut, and sometimes I look back. But this is slightly off the question, but it's more that I add, because I read this wonderful interview with Faye Weldon, who just died about in maybe late December, a British novelist, and it was an interview with her, and she said that when she worked with students and she read their work and they were worried and they said they were stuck and maybe they had writer's block, and she said, no, it's not you, it's the work, which is about the worst thing you ever want to hear. But then she said, maybe you have to add someone, you have to add a character. And I found that is one of my guiding principles, and I did it with in Ms. Demeanor and in Good Riddance. It was just, I have to add someone. I need another character. I have to open it up.
I was actually also trained as a playwright before I transitioned to writing novels. So the three-act structure is also like cemented, and also the one-act structure for the one-act plays, wild. But yeah, so I always know that in the first chapter I have to have, because I write romances, romantic comedies, I have to have the meet cute. And the meet cute is where the two love interests meet each other for the first time, and it has to be big, and it has to be memorable, and it has to be like something that also I call back to in the final chapters when like we're all saying goodbye to the characters. So I try to make like circular narratives in that way so that I can like start off a story almost exactly how I end it, and mirror like a character growth and character arcs, and that's how I like to like clean everything up and make a story.
So we're in the Q&A period. Ashley, how has your life changed since being selected as GMA Book Club?
That's a good question.
And how did you find out?
Oh, okay. So I was actually on the way to a bookstore, a used bookstore, because I go once a week to try and like collect the series that I'm collecting at the moment. And I was in the parking lot of the used bookstore, and my editor and agent both called me at the exact same time, and I was like, oh no, this is something bad. This can't be good, because usually when they both call you, it's not a good thing. And so I was like, hello? And they're like, are you sitting down? And I'm like, yeah, I just parked. What is it? And they're like, The Dead Romantics has been selected as the Good Morning America July Book Club pick. And I just started crying because it was something that I never in a million years thought would happen to my little ghost book. And so I had to get trained in like a media training, which was wild. I had like meetings set up, and I had to go to like media training classes, and then I had to get a new wardrobe because obviously you can't go on Good Morning America in jeans and a t-shirt, sadly. So I got a new wardrobe, and it was a phenomenal experience. I flew up to New York. I did it in a small little bookstore in Rhinebeck called Oblong Books. I love Oblong. They're so pleasant. My best friend's the manager of Oblong, and so I was very excited to do it in their bookstore. And like since then, it's just been a really lovely time. So that's it.
Jean, somebody was listening. What television work have you written, and for what did you win your Emmy?
So I won my Emmy for Outstanding Children's Series for the show Assignment Discovery, which was on the Discovery Channel, and for a while it was North America's largest distributor of educational programming. Beat out Big Bird.
All authors, and Elinor, we're going to start with you. Oh, I love this question. What is something you wrote that was so outrageous you had to omit it from a novel? Stumper.
So wrote it and then cut it out.
Because it was outrageous.
Outrageous. Well, I had a whole book that was outrageous. Rachel to the rescue, and I'm going to be delicate here, politically speaking. I'm in Florida, but my character had a job that people thought I invented, where she taped together all of the documents, emails, any paper that Donald Trump ripped up. And in fact, this is a real job. It's the White House Office of Records Management. And so my character gets fired from that job and then onward and gets other jobs. But as it was being distributed, and I'd never had a book turned down, so I just thought, this is going to be a big book. They're probably going to be all fighting over this one. But the publishers said they were worried about, by the time it came out, there would be Trump fatigue. So it got published in England first on American Election Day, and then Hundt Mifflin, my publisher, stepped up. Okay, so I would say that's kind of my flirtation with outrageousness.
Ashley?
Oh boy, are there any kids in here? So I write romances, and so one of the nickname for the Dead Romantics was Ghost Boners.
So the publishers
so
obviously
bad.
changed the name.
I've heard
Obviously
worse.
changed the name. So yeah, like for a very long time, it was referred to by that name, and then my agent, before we like submitted it to editors, my agent was like, "So do you have an actual name for this book?" And I was like, "No, we're going out with that." She's like, "No, we're not, Ashley." And I was like, "You're right. No, we're not." So I put my undergraduate degree to good use. I was an English major, and I did a lot of studies with Romanticism. So I called it the Dead Romantics, and there's a lot of like callbacks to Romantic poets. And yeah, so it's not called that anymore, but now it's called Dead Romantics. So there we go.
All right, Jean, outrageous.
I mean, I kind of feel like Elinor, that my books are slightly outrageous in terms of like the comedy and the antics that happen. But I guess I'm more innocent than you two because for me, I have to write for a broad audience and also a Jewish audience. So there's different sensibilities there, and so. I mean, for myself, at night with a martini, I might write a scene, but it doesn't make it into the book. You know what I mean? And that's because I have to write for different audiences. So maybe I'm innocent, or maybe I'm just hiding that side of myself. I don't know. I'll leave it to you guys to figure out.
Okay, so I know the answer to the next one for two of you, but Elinor, you are the dark horse in this one. Can you comment on your next book or project? So Ashley's got a book coming out, and Jean's got a book coming out. So Ashley, and then Elinor, you get to follow up.
Yeah, I'm working on the next one. I think I have about 80 pages until I, cut most of them. So, yes, so my narrator has an estate sale business. So that's kind of it. And I've never done this. I crowdsourced, not the name of the book, but the name of the estate sale business, and I was amazed, so I shouldn't, insult Facebook. I was amazed at how many people immediately, like it was all they thought about. They came up with the names of it. So I end up, so far I think it's the name of the business is Finders Keepers, but somebody also suggested you can't take it with you, which I love. But anyway, yes, so that can be a competitor. Golden Oldies is a competitor. So that's it, and yeah.
Ashley?
I have 3 books out this year, actually. No, I did not sleep last year. That did not happen. My next adult rom-com is coming out on June 27th. It's called The 7-Year Slip. It is about 2 people who meet in an apartment that's slightly magical because they are 7 years apart. So it's a time travel romance. And it's like The Lake House, kind of, but it has a happy ending, I promise. And then I have 2 young adult books coming out as well. I have a Buffy book coming out in August, and then I have a Marvel book coming out in October.
And Jean, I know 3 is coming out and 4 is in the works. So.
That's correct, yeah. So my 3rd book is going to be called Kissing Kosher. It's kind of a throwback to my first book, The Matzo Ball, in that it's about the heir to a baked good empire. He goes undercover at a small family bakery in Brooklyn in order to steal their recipe for their world-famous recipe for pumpkin spice babka. And of course, while there, he meets the granddaughter of the small-town bakery, Avital Cohen, a woman who is suffering from sexual dysfunction due to chronic pelvic pain. And this is actually my first book that kind of gets into some sexy area, but I felt it was important because we're dealing with chronic pain and sexual dysfunction in romance. Why not? Of course. So I'm really excited about that book because I think it's going to be a good starting point for conversation for lots of folks. And it has a happy ending, and it's super funny. So,
And did one of them go to Camp Ahava?
so that is my universe. Yes, Camp Ahava is, if you're Jewish summer camp is a really big thing. And so all my characters in all my books at one point have gone to Camp Ahava, which might or may not be a kind of shadow organization for Camp Vermont, if anyone knows that camp. So.
All in upstate New York, right?
All, of course. I'm a Northeast girl, so yes, Berkshires.
And book 4, does it have a working title?
So I cannot really talk about book 4 yet.
All right,
but,
mum's the word.
Contractual obligations.
So totally contracted, but until like the actual like title is out there and the topic, and actually because sort of everything I do is sort of a challenge to myself and sort of like a, I don't want to say first, but like trying to do something different. I don't like to talk about it until it's like in, I'm sure you know
same way. I have,
Yeah, 'cause
I
I get
have 2
nervous.
more rom-coms also
Yes.
contracted.
So you get nervous, you don't want like, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, last question for each of you. Ashley, you're going to start first. Favorite author, not you, to read?
Oh, it's easy. I've already talked about her. Diana Wynne Jones. She's my favorite. Can I like have like a small like story time session? Very small. Oh no, 1 minute. Never mind.
No.
We're not going.
Sorry.
Ask me later. It's
come
really
meet
great.
Ashley in the cafeteria later.
It has to do with Tolkien.
Elinor, favorite author to read who's not you?
Oh, I have to give 3 because these are all late, dear friends of mine. Started with Carol Shields, who wrote Stone Diaries. When she was dying, I said to her, I'll always name you first, and then second. Anita Shreve was a very close friend, so I told her the same thing. And then best friend for 40 years, Maymeave Medwed, and this book is dedicated to her. So they're all wonderful novelists.
So obviously my favorite authors are Ashley Poston and Elinor Lipman. Poston.
So sweet.
And with
Not
that,
allowed.
Go buy their books and then buy mine too.
We are playing you off the stage now.
Thank you all for coming. Of course, the authors will be across the way for you to meet. See us over there.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Our final panel for the day is historical fiction, moderated by the incomparable Paula Hundt. Paula moved to Martin County in 1996, and you can read about her in the program, but I want to give you the backstory on Paula. She has a very deep love for this community, and she's retired twice, unsuccessfully both times because she's gone back to work. These days, she's volunteering at a number of places, including the farm at House of Hope and the soup kitchen at St. Mary's. She supports a number of organizations with her time and treasures. She's a world-class cook and will be competing for the title of Top Chef Martin County on May 8th. And she's an adventurous traveler. And I'm also going to warn you, this is a very rowdy panel of authors. So please welcome Paula to the stage with her authors, Brendan Slocumb, Fiona Davis, and Madeline Martin.
We did not plan to match. We did not.
You're welcome.
Well, please say good afternoon to your new best friends. And thank you so much for coming this afternoon and for being here earlier today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as the authors have enjoyed it. They were saying that this is one of the best festivals that they've ever attended. So. And it's because of having engaged readers and participants like you that it makes it so much fun. So thank you again. Let me pass these down.
I hear this is a good book.
Shameless plugging already. All right, we'll get started here this afternoon. Let me turn this just a little bit so I can look at you. Fiona's on the end down there. Fiona Davis, if you want to hold up your book. The Magnolia Palace takes place in 1919 and 1996 and is the story of Lillian, who's using a pseudonym and she's a famed model in New York City, adorning buildings, parks, fountains, and through a misunderstanding about a murder, is forced to flee and stumbles into a job at the Frick Mansion as a personal secretary to Helen Frick, daughter of wealthy Henry Clay Frick, who was not necessarily a nice man. The 1966 part involves a British model and a curator who are stuck in the mansion and begin to uncover secrets of the family's past. Fiona has written 7 books, historical fiction, about iconic buildings in New York City. In fact, we all want to take a tour. She's written about the Grand Central Terminal, the Dakota, the New York Public Library, the Chelsea Hotel, the Barbizon Hotel, the Frick Museum, and Carnegie Hall. Sounds like a great trip. She was also a TV actress in the soap opera that went for 35 years. She appeared in the last season, Another World. And I think their tagline was, "When I am with you, you take me away to another world." Fiona appeared as Dr. Doyle in the 1990 series. She also appeared in a crime drama called Della Ventura that starred Danny Aiello. She was off-Broadway playing in that and regional theater as well. So we thank you very much, Fiona, for being here.
Thank you.
Brendan Slocumb, the man brave enough to sit between these two women.
And to wear pink.
That's only because you didn't have purple. The Violin Conspiracy is the story of Raekwon, known as Ray, a black musician preparing for the most prestigious worldwide competition, the Tchaikovsky in Russia, when his Stradivarius violin is stolen and held for ransom. Ray battles prejudice and racism in the music world, a divided family in turmoil, greed, love, and betrayal, as well as the challenge of the ownership of the instrument itself. This was his debut novel, written in 2.5 months. I believe, in one of his interviews, I believe someone asked you about it, and you said, well, you were just sitting there eating and getting fat, and so you thought you'd do something. Thank you for writing for us. He began playing the violin at age 9, and it saved his life. A musician, concertmaster, and 23 years as a teacher, a band member, and a philanthropist for children to have access to musical instruments, music, and health care. Thank you. Madeline Martin, The Librarian's Spy, is set in the 1940s in Portugal and France during World War II. American librarians were sent to neutral countries to monitor the wartime communications and provide intelligence and report back. Ava, who's in Portugal, connects with Helene, or Elaine as it was, a resistance fighter, and through their contacts and coded messages, they are helping people try to escape the Nazis. Madeline has written 38 books. Now, over 30 of them were historical romance novels, and in doing some research, I advised Madeline that I know she didn't pick the cover, but they are some of the steamiest covers I have ever seen on the romance novels. So if you're looking for a little diversion, go take a look there. She was working a day job and writing 6 to 8 books a year. Now that she's writing full-time, she's writing 1 book a year.
I needed a break.
She loves research and travel to research. And she feels that romance novels that she has written are about empowered women and the men strong enough to love them. I thought it would be good, that's for Madeline. These authors put so much into these books that I wanted them to start out by reading the first paragraph of their book so that you could have their voice in your head when you read. Fiona, if you'll start.
Sure. So the book starts in the 1919 era. New York City, 1919. Lillian Carter stood half naked,
one arm held up like a ballet dancer, the other hanging lightly down at her side, and calculated how long she could avoid paying rent while her landlord was in jail. If Mr. Watkins was released right away, she'd have to avoid him until she pulled together enough money to pay for the one-bedroom apartment she leased in the crumbling 5-story tenement building on 65th Street. Not an easy task when Mr. Watkins and his wife lived off the lobby on the first floor. On the bright side, the Watkins couple had shouted each other to pieces in a terrible fight earlier that morning, the screeching carrying on for a good 45 minutes before silence finally reigned.
Ta-dum. Madeline, if you'll go next.
By the way, once you guys hear Brendan read, you'll realize why I asked for me to not follow him. No pressure, man. He got this. Okay. April 1943, Washington, D.C. There was nothing Ava Harper loved more than the smell of old books. The musty scent of aging paper and steel ink took one on a journey through candlelit rooms of manors set amid verdant hills, or ancient castles with turrets that stretched up to the vast unknown heavens. These were tomes once cradled in the spread palms of forefathers, pored over by scholars, devoured by students with a rapacious appetite for learning, and those fragrant yellowed pages were stories of the past and eternal knowledge.
And I think for those of us who love books, I could just almost smell the pages as I read those words. And that's, as a librarian, Ava was the key to that, and so dedicated to the books. Brendan, if you'll read yours.
On the morning of the worst, most earth-shattering day of Ray McMillan's life, he ordered room service, scrambled eggs for 2, one side of regular bacon for Nicole, one side of vegan sausage for him, one coffee for Nicole, one orange juice for him. Later, he would try to second-guess those choices and 1,000 others that, in hindsight, vibrated in his memory. What if he had ordered French toast instead of eggs? What if grapefruit juice instead of orange? What if no juice at all? Breakfast had materialized before he'd gotten out of the shower. He'd lost track of time, caught up in the fingering of the Tchaikovsky concerto's triple stops, and water sluiced down for 10 minutes while he gaped at the tiny bar of hotel soap. When he walked out naked of the bathroom, the aroma of bacon wreathed in the suite.
Anybody interested in bacon?
Can I also just point out that the former romance author was the only one that didn't have a naked person in the front of the book?
That's because you had them all on the cover. All 3 of these books were written during the pandemic. And so we want to start with asking you, because most of us struggle in trying to write right after we get the word dear so-and-so, the next word doesn't come. How do you start writing? The paragraph that you read, was that your first paragraph? How do you put that first word on the page in any order?
I know the scene that I want to start with. It's usually one that's fairly explosive, so there's something really happening to draw the reader in. And so for me, it was having this woman who's a very successful artist's model in the early 1900s. The thought of her posing naked just seemed to capture the story of her life, of being completely nude, but thinking about, okay, how am I going to make rent, you know? And the fact that she becomes these beautiful statues that are all over New York City, and the woman it's based on, you know, really existed, and there's statues of her all over New York, and yet her life is very mundane until something happens to just drive it and just kind of split everything open.
For me, the opening sentence was the very last thing that I wrote. I wanted to, I liked the story, so I needed a way to really catch people's attention. And the worst, most earth-shattering day of your life, what could that possibly be? And I figured, you know what, I want to know what it was. What does this have to do with orange juice? I have to keep reading. I think it worked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wrote mine like 10,000 times. But, you know, for me, I really wanted to illustrate, because with Ava, before she ends up being sort of tossed into one of the neutral countries during World War II to gather intel, she's working at a library and really, like,
she was not meant to be a spy. I feel like if I was ever going to be a spy, I would kind of be like her. And so I really wanted to drive home her love of books, her comfort in the location that she's at, where she works at the Library of Congress. And so I really wanted to seed that part of her character into the readers' hearts going forward.
Do you know the ending when you start?
I do. I'm an absolute plotter. My parents are both engineers. And so I usually start with the character, and then I really try and figure out what the story will be, and I end up with about an 8 to 10 page single-spaced outline that I can follow as I write. And so I do know the twists. I do know, because I love a book with good twists, and I know how it's going to end before I start writing. And that helps, because with my books, if there's 2 timelines and an element of mystery between them, if I give away something too early in one timeline, it'll completely wreck the tension in the other one. And so it does have to be very carefully stitched together to become the whole book. And the moment when I'm outlining and trying to figure out how to pull off the mystery and the twist, that's usually the week or 2 that I'm drinking heavily at night. It's so hard.
Well, I'm not a drinker. I do other things, like... no, I actually had 3 different endings for this book, and the characters actually determined which ending I was going to use. I am just, I'm very, very flexible. I read it through the first time. Wow, I like that, but I think I can make the stakes even higher. Wow, I like that second time I went through. I think I can do it even better. So it changes constantly, but I definitely do outline, and I don't drink, but other things happen at night like that too.
I also am a plotter. I like to joke that I'm so type A that I'm 12-point Times New Roman font. So, really for me, I really front-load my book with a ton of research. So I do about 10 months worth of research before I even actually create my characters. And then once I have my characters fully fleshed out, then I go to my plot. And then I'm able to really kind of put my whole plot together. So, and it's really actually very helpful, because then you can just kind of follow point A to point B, and it makes writing it a lot smoother. So, I mean, it really only takes me about a month or 2 to write a book, because I spend about, 3 months pulling that whole plot together.
I saw an interview of you, and behind you was the whiteboard that had, how did you describe it? 3 layers. It's what's done, what needs to be done, and what will be done in order to try to keep those things.
Yes, so those are my quarterly goals, because I really am like a big planning nerd. And I have a giant whiteboard that reminds me every day of all the things I need to do. And so the very top is what needs to be done during that quarter. The middle is what I'm in the process of doing. And the bottom is what has been done. And sadly, that bottom portion is never as full as I would like it to be.
Thinking of your processes, have you ever put a character in and then later gone back and said, nah, taking them out? Who was that? I don't remember. Why were they in my story to begin with?
Not in my historical fiction, but I did have that happen in one of my romances once, and I realized that it'd just be easier to kill her than to take her out and rewrite the whole thing. So she died.
That is actually a great question and a great point. I had a character in the story. He was Ray's manager, and his name was Drew. And he got so big, he started to take over the entire story. And I realized after rereading, oh my gosh, this dude has an entire book to himself. I've got to take him out. He's in my scraps pile, and I refuse to kill him. I'm going to do a book just on that guy, because he was so cool. He's the coolest guy you've ever met in your life. You want to hang out with this guy. And he totally overshadowed everyone else in the book. So I'm like, I can't. He's too cool of a character, so that's a good problem to have, but I definitely have him in my scraps pile for another book.
Yeah, I had the opposite problem, actually. In my book takes place in 1919 at the Frick Mansion, and that was a mansion that a family of 3 lived there, and they were served by a staff of 27. Nice ratio. And so I had, certain members of the staff were important to the story, and I had the main characters. And after I wrote the first draft, I realized that I needed to divert more attention away from who did the murder. I felt like it was too obvious. And I thought, well, I need to add a character in to accomplish that. And so I added in a character, and it was tricky kind of trying to shoehorn a new person into this community that I'd created. But it was the right thing to do. And I remember as I was writing the book, I was thinking, I need one more person. And I kept on putting it off, and finally I thought, okay, just buckle down and make those changes.
I was wondering, did you receive rejection notices when you first started out?
Yes.
Would you care to tell us how many?
How many?
100.
Oh.
Absolutely. But it's okay because I didn't start off as a writer. I am a teacher. I'm a music teacher. And, I've written most of my life. I'm a songwriter. I've written, I would correct my friends' papers and everything. And the first book I wrote 20 years ago, it's a science fiction book. It's the greatest book ever written. It is awesome. So when I submitted it, naturally, I didn't expect that many rejection notes, but I have a stack of 100. And to this day, I still think that they don't know what they were talking about because that book is great. But everything that I'd read, it said expect to have rejection. And as a musician, I'm accustomed to rejection and critiques. I just take everything that I read and I tried to do my books better. And I accepted it all, and it's okay. And I also burned every one of those letters.
Did you, Fiona?
When I was in my early 30s, I wrote 2 mysteries that were contemporary mysteries. And, no one wanted them, which was probably a good idea. And it wasn't until I was in my late 40s that I came up with the idea of setting a story at the Barbizon Hotel for women, just because its rich history just really grabbed me. And I'm so glad I waited, because I felt like I needed to go through some things in life. You need to go out there and live your life and have your heart broken and figure things out before you can create characters who are living their lives truly as well. And so I'm glad those books didn't get picked up, because I think I was thin as a writer then, and it wasn't until I was in my late 40s that everything came together, and it came together at the right time.
I did not receive any rejections. However, it's not because I'm that good, I promise. So I actually had written 2 books, and I thought, I want to get these published, because I, wrote 2 books, and I thought it was going to be super easy. It's not. And so I joined a local writers group, and this one girl said, let's swap some chapters. So I said, okay. So we swapped some chapters, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing. And so I stopped everything. I think this goes back to my type A personality, and I spent the next 5 years researching everything I possibly could about the craft of writing. I attended workshops, I went to conferences, I listened to CDs on tape, that'll let you know, or books on CD, that'll tell you how old that was. And so after 5 years, I put all of that knowledge to test, and I created my first book that was not one of the ones that's underneath the bed that nobody will ever read. And I submitted those to 3 contests. I finaled in all 3. I won first place in all 3. And so my next conference that I went to, I pitched to my dream agent, and she accepted me, and I got a 3-book deal. So that was a very long journey to get to that point after those 5 years. But I was very, very lucky to have not had the rejections. So.
I can give you some of my rejection letters.
No,
burned them all.
You burned them all. You don't have them anymore because you burned them all. Sorry. Question. The compelling similarities between these 3 books, one of which is strong women in each of the books. Brendan, would you start talking about the strong women in your books? Your book, sorry.
Lots of strong women in the Violin conspiracy. Most importantly, I think, is Ray's grandmother, who is Grandma Nora, who is actually my maternal grandmother. And it's funny you mentioned, Fiona, having lived experiences to be able to really develop these characters. I asked my aunts and uncles and cousins, was Grandma really this sweet, or was it just me? Every one of them said the exact same thing. She was just never had a bad thing to say about anyone. Another character, strong woman, Dr. Janice Stevens, is modeled after my college violin professor, who not only taught me how to play the violin, but she taught me how to teach. You know, to this day, I still mention her name every opportunity I get, Dr. Rochelle Vetter Huang, because she is incredible, and she's one of the reasons that I'm still here. One of the characters, Ray's aunt, his aunt Rochelle, she's instrumental, got it in there. she's
It's a quick crowd, they'll get it.
Sorry, I've been here for a while. She's instrumental in supporting him, and just lots of female characters that really build up the character of Ray. And, even his girlfriend, Nicole, supports him tremendously. And he's got a lot of strong women in his life, and they're really important to him in the book.
Before we go on from that, have most of you read the book already?
Oh, wow.
Oh, good. Well, and this is no spoiler alert because it's already on the first page, but the violin is stolen. The rest of the book is what happens after that. So I guess, would you relate a little bit of your own personal experience about that?
I was a senior in high school. I just bought a 1953 Eugene Lehman violin. It was supposed to carry me through college, through my professional career. We went on a trip out of town, and we come back. I don't know if you've ever had your home invaded, but the moment you walk in, something is not right. And all of the furniture and appliances and the TVs that were not there, the radios that were gone, I didn't care about any of that stuff. I ran right to my hiding spot under my bed for my violin. I looked, it wasn't there. I looked again, it wasn't there. I walked out of the room and I walked back in because it's supposed to be there, and it wasn't there. And to this day, there is a hole in my soul missing because that violin was gone, and I worked for it, and I didn't have it anymore, and somebody's playing on it. So if anybody knows where that fiddle is, I won't say a word, I promise. Just give it back, please.
That's been a few years, but that's a compelling beginning for this book. Regarding empowered women, Madeline or Fiona?
So with the Librarian Spy, it's set during World War II, and with Ava's character, I have two female protagonists. One is Ava, who is an American, and she's, like I said before, sent over to a neutral country to gather intel. And when during World War II and women had to step up and really fill a lot of these roles that men would otherwise have, the men who were in those roles helping them or really showing them the ropes originally really were very disparaging toward them. And so with Ava's side of the story, you really do see her having to sort of stand up for herself and really prove that she is strong enough to take on this role and very capable. And then with Elaine's perspective, she's in Lyon, France, and she's working with the French resistance. And the most wonderful thing about Elaine's character is she's actually based off of a woman who actually existed during the French resistance named Lucienne Guesniac. And she operated the printing press for the French underground newspaper Combat. And she just really was such an incredible woman. Her story, I actually wanted to write a whole entire book about it, but my publisher was like, no, probably not, because it was this whole thing with French resistance. There was a bunch coming out, and so I wish every idea that we pitch could always be sold, but this one wasn't. And so I did get to still use the idea for a woman inspired by her character for The Librarian Spy with Elaine's character. She's just incredible.
Yeah, speaking of inspired by real people, two of the characters in my book are, one is Helen Frick, who was the daughter of Henry Clay Frick. And she was this very prickly, temperamental woman who never married, never had kids, created an amazing art reference library next door to the Frick collection, which is still around today. But she was the type of woman who in the 20s, when everybody was bobbing their hair, she disapproved. So if any of her friends bobbed their hair, she dumped them. She was very, very tough throughout her entire life. And the other woman who's inspired by real life is the character of Lillian, who's inspired by a woman named Audrey Munson. And she is carved in stone above the door of the Frick. And I saw that figure and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I went down this rabbit hole with her where she was considered the supermodel of the early 1900s. And she posed for hundreds of sculptors. And she can be found on Columbus Circle, in front of the Plaza Hotel, in front of the New York Public Library. She's everywhere. And what happened to her was incredible. She did really well, and then she got caught up in this scandal, and where her landlord killed his wife. And the police, as they were investigating, found a black and white photo of Audrey Munson in a bathing suit from when she was modeling. And they decided it was a love triangle, and they started hounding her. And she and her mother fled upstate, and the character's trajectory in the book is different from the actual Audrey Munson's, but what happened to Audrey Munson was she just didn't do well. She tried to get into silent films, that didn't work. She eventually tried to die by suicide by drinking mercury, and finally was put into an asylum where she died in 1996 at the age of 104. And at that time, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And I just thought, here's this woman who's been lost to history, right? We know the men's names, we know the sculptors' names, but here's this woman who's all over New York and we don't know her. And the same with Helen Frick, where she was overshadowed by her father, who everybody knows. And so for me, it was a way to create Lillian, who again has a very different trajectory in the book, I promise you, is a way to really celebrate these women who we might not know about.
And the modeling that was done was really quite on the up and up. It was very artistic. Her mother was always with her, and she was sought out by the greatest of sculptors for her beauty, not for pornographic or other reasons. So, very interesting. I think there's another similarity in your three books, and that is one compelling emotion is fear. I think in the case of Ray, without the violin, will he be the violinist that he thinks he is? In the case of Ava, certainly she's a spy, but Elaine, death, torture from the French resistance side if she's caught. And on Lillian, certainly exposure and tossed out into the streets. You all have just met for the first time yesterday and bonded very well, I might say. This is the rowdy panel. But did you think about the fact that fear was a driver in your book?
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, these women are working in a really uncertain, unsupportive world, and they're trying to make their way. And as a woman in the times, in '66 even, you couldn't have your own checking account without a man signing off for it. You couldn't have a credit card. It was really hard to live your life and pursue your dreams. And so, yeah, for me, the fear is that they could just be thrown out and discarded if they didn't toe the line and follow, what men told them to do. And so I find that's a really interesting thing to dive into in history, is to show how women were treated back then and show how things have changed or maybe how they haven't.
For Ray as a musician, and I think for any musicians you can relate to this, is it going to be enough? Is what I do enough? The hours and hours and hours of practice, is it going to be enough? You always have that fear in the back of your mind that you haven't done enough. And then put on top of that, someone steals your $10 million violin, which some people say, the only reason you're where you are is because of the instrument. That even adds an added layer of fear to it. And it's you are constantly second guessing yourself. As a musician, I can only speak for myself, but I am my own worst critic. I personally don't think I've ever given a good performance. It could always be better, and I am constantly critiquing myself, and that fear is always in the back of your mind, always. It's like, is it me or is it the instrument? Have I done enough? Are they going to enjoy it? What are they going to think of me? So that fear is real. It's really real.
He does not have the instrument with him, or any, because we did ask, but traveling these days with something would be so hard to get through security, and whatever your instrument might be. But we were, if anybody has a viola or a violin out there in the audience, just bring it on up, I'm sure. Madeline?
So yes, with Elaine, with the librarian spy, she was with the French resistance, and initially in the beginning of the Nazi occupation, they enlisted a lot of collaborators. They had a certain amount that they wanted to try and have by a certain date, and they were even shocked when they exceeded that number well before the due date. So in addition to having Nazis everywhere and German police and even the French police, you also had collaborators who were working with the Nazis. And the French resistance, pretty much everywhere they went, they were constantly being hunted. It really isn't documented as often, though I read a lot about it in my research, where a lot of people suffered from like their nerves completely unraveling. Imagine you're trying to sleep at night, and every single time you hear a little bump or a sound, you think that that might be the Nazis coming for you, and you and your whole family are going to be killed because of it. I mean, just you can't trust anybody, you can't go anywhere, you're starving. It was such a horrible situation. And so Elaine's side of the story really definitely does delve into that fear aspect of what people with the French resistance had to deal with.
I was going to ask you, I think, how you create your gut-wrenching, abdomen-contracting, sphincter-tightening, that being discovered, captured, and tortured for espionage, subterfuge as a freedom activist would bring. How do you conjure up those words?
You know, well, I read a lot of firsthand accounts as part of my research. You hadn't really kept track of it beforehand, but with my the next book that I'm working on, or that is coming out and is set in Warsaw, Poland, and I happen to keep track of that because I don't know, got on this weird kick. So I realized I had over 100 nonfiction books, and I had over 15 spiral-bound notebooks filled with handwritten notes. So that will give you kind of an idea of how much research I do for my historical fiction. And when I go through that nonfiction, those nonfiction books, there's a lot of firsthand accounts, and those are so integral for creating the actual setting that really, you know, takes you back to what life was like then. And so a lot of, not necessarily the descriptions, but I guess like the feel of what these people had to endure really comes from a lot of those firsthand accounts.
And you do talk about the fact that when you're researching in a town, you might put 20,000 steps in a day, making sure that she's walking the right streets to make sure that they intersect as she puts them in her book and are not made up, because someone's about to catch that for sure, as we've heard.
Yes.
Fiona, how did acting help your writing, or does it?
Yeah, you know, I went to New York as an actress right after college, and I did Broadway and off-Broadway and worked with a theater company where we all collaborated and put 3 shows a year on off-Broadway, from Shakespeare to Genet. It was all my friends from then are my best friends today. It was such a wonderful time. And as I hit my late 20s, I realized that all my friends who were women who were a little older weren't working anymore. And then all my male friends were aging into really cool character roles. And I thought, well, that's not fair. And so then I went off to get a master's in journalism, which kind of sent me down the road of writing. But what really helped in terms of theater were a couple things. One is that plays are all dialogue, right? You can't sit there and describe the room. And so it's so concise in a play where the playwright has to fit everything he's trying to say on the page in just dialogue. And so I think it helped having read so many plays. And then the other thing is when you're stage managing a scene, in your head you have to have people move and do things in a scene, because otherwise it's really boring to have 2 people sitting in a chair talking. You need to have some kind of active movement, and they need to have an objective. And that's the same as on the stage. And so I think it helped in that way in terms of just figuring out how to make a scene dynamic. It was very helpful.
A comment that I found, author Fiona Davis stands out among other historical fiction authors due to her compelling storytelling, meticulous research, and her ability to bring historical New York City landmarks to life. Readers often praise her for the vivid descriptions and the strong, relatable female characters in her book.
Thank you.
So, as you said, the staging is important from part of that, to describe the buildings that you've selected as you're just walking around New York City.
Yeah, for sure, because the buildings become another character in many ways, if it's working.
Brendan, we have some quotes here from you, and you said, "Alone, we are a solitary violin, a lonely flute, a trumpet singing in the dark. Together, we are a symphony. I believe strongly that music is a life force and a transformative experience, and that novels are songs without music." Would you talk a little bit about your band?
Yeah. I am a musician. I know I don't look like the typical violinist. I know. I've accepted it. I understand that. I've been playing violin since I was 9 years old, and I've always loved music. I became a music teacher. I've taught orchestra, band, general music, guitar, and I formed a band with some of my students. Guitar students, you know, and the drummer in the band currently is one of my old violin students who switched to percussion. And it's so much fun because I know those guys, I know what they can do, and it's so much fun to watch them creating and doing what they do so well. And they trust me because they know me as their teacher, and now I'm their friend. And it's really weird because I always see these, for any teachers out there, you know, you see a student, a former student, they're always that 14, 15-year-old kid, right? We will be at rehearsal and somebody will have a beer, and I'm just like, what are you doing? No. Oh, dude, you're like 30. Okay, yeah, you can do that. So we're just a big, happy family, and the songs that I write for them, you know, they sound one way in my head, and when I give them to the guys to play, they put their own spins on them, and it's so awesome seeing them develop this something that I came up with. You know, it may start off with 3 or 4 notes, and they turn it into some amazing thing, and you know, it's just incredible, and knowing that I had a little bit of something to do with that, because they're such good people, and I love performing with them, and I love seeing them create, and I love the music that they are able to create together, and it is just the best thing. And I would recommend being in a band with people that you really like.
How gratifying to see students progress like that. The name of the band, just so you would pronounce it, not me, is?
Geppetto's Wood.
I'd like to give you a little comment. SoundCloud calls it the band that pushes the boundaries of rock while delivering a booty-shaking beat by drawing upon virtuosity, honesty, and lyrics. You can catch it on YouTube if you like. I did.
Go to SoundCloud.
You talked a little bit about your editing process. How do you write, rewrite? When do you read? Who reads your books? Who gets to the inner circle first?
So I don't actually edit my book as I'm writing it. Otherwise, I would probably never write my book because I would constantly go back and correct. And so basically, I'll make a notepad next to my book where I keep track of if anything changes or I want to make any updates to it. I note the place where I'm located at in that book and what needs to change. So when I go back and do my final read-through, I know to correct it in that particular area. I also have a wonderful, wonderful friend of mine who reads every single book as I'm writing it, which is wonderful because if I ever feel like I'm completely veering off track, first of all, I can say, is this horrible and all awful and wrong? And she'll come back and say, no, because of this, this, and this, and this. And I'm like, oh, thank God. And then also, if I ever get to a point where I kind of get myself into a corner and say, I don't know how to get out of this, she has wonderful suggestions because she's basically reading it as I'm writing it. So it works out so incredibly well. And then after I do my one final read-through, I send it off to my editor and cross my fingers that they like it.
Yeah, I do about 3 or 4 months of research and then do a very quick first draft, which takes about 3 to 4 months. And the same thing, then I just start layering in edits to hopefully make it sing. I send it to my mother pretty early on because she's English and her only comment is usually, it's lovely. And that's what you need after the first draft because you know it's not.
That is true.
And then it's just layers and layers of building it up, rereading it, stepping away from it, taking a break, going back, until finally it feels like it's ready to go to my agent, and then it goes to my editor. So I'd say I do about 10 rounds of revisions.
If I can also add really quick, too, my mom actually reads mine, but she likes it in the galley phase. I tried doing it in the rough phase one time, and she was like, I can't even read this. I don't even know what this is. So after my editor read through it, now she reads it in the galley phase, and she has no problem sending me a ton of corrections to fix.
You can send it to my mom if you want.
Next time. Thank you.
I, unlike my friends here, would never let my mom read anything. No. Oh, and by the way, if you've read The Violin Conspiracy, Mom in the book is not my mom. I promise you, she's not my mom. I am so fortunate to have friends who are authors that are honest, and I let my author friends read it. Tell me what you think. Is this boring? How's the pacing in this? Does this make sense? And because my books have a musical tint to them, I really like to have non-musicians read them because early on when I was doing the first draft of Violin Conspiracy, everything was technical, and it made perfect sense to me as a violinist and a musician. I was talking about bowings and articulations and this and this and this and all these Italian terms, and it looked great on the page to me, and I let one of my, I don't know what this is. What is this supposed to be? So it really helps to have someone who is unfamiliar with what it is that you do read through it so that they can relate. If it's not relatable, then I know I need to do something different.
A question from the audience, and Fiona, I'm going to put this out because we've talked about this. Have you ever thought of organizing a tour of all the sites of your books?
Yeah, we were talking about this. After my very first book came out, The Dollhouse, which is set at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, I got an email from this book club in South Boston. And they said, we want to come down and tour the spots that you mentioned in that book. And I said, okay, sure. And they showed up, and they were on this huge bus, and there were 40 of them. They were all drunk because they've been drinking the whole time. They're wonderful people. And we did this great tour of, all the different spots that were highlighted in the book and had lunch, and they've done it for every book since. And it's just a treat. We've already planned out the December one. And so it's really fun. And yeah, I think that's a great idea. If I could make some money off that, that'd be great.
Book tours are a necessary part of promotion, but do you enjoy it? And what is the favorite part or the least favorite parts?
I enjoy it. I think it's fun. It's so wonderful getting to be around people who love books and who really are coming together for books. It's super fun for that reason, and just getting to meet so many wonderful people, especially people who maybe I've only met on Instagram before or social media, and getting to meet them face to face. It really is just like such a fabulous moment. The hardest part is I'm a mom. I have a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old and two very spoiled cats who miss me immensely. I pull out my suitcase and my cat gets very despondent because she knows I'm going to be gone for at least a day or two. And that probably is the hardest part, but I'm very fortunate to have a wonderful husband who is able to keep everything up and running, for the most part, while I'm gone.
Who's always introduced as Mr. Awesome, by the way.
He really is awesome.
We were all fortunate here in our system of Audible books through Libby, to have all of these books available to us to listen to before this event came up. In your Audible books, do you participate at all in the selection of who will be reading your book?
100%. I was given for the Violin Conspiracy, I was given a list of 4 gentlemen to read the book, and they read each an excerpt. And they were all very, very good. And just the fact that I was the one that got to choose, I thought that was fantastic. Yeah, but the pressure was super high. What if he sounds good reading this chapter, but the next chapter he just completely blows it? But J.D. Jackson read The Violin Conspiracy and did a fantastic job. And I was really honored that I had the privilege of selecting the reader. And it was, it's a big responsibility because, it's going to represent your book. So you really have to be spot on with that choice. And I'm glad that they did give me that opportunity.
And I shared with Brendan that I read that his reader had just won the Audie Award from Audible for being the best male narrator.
That's huge. And tell them who's doing the next book, who's narrating the next book.
I've been told that my voice is not awful. So I actually read the author's notes for my first 2 books. I read the author's notes, and when I went and did the recording at the studio, have you ever considered reading your own book? I was like, yeah. Why? Because I think you should. You think so? Yeah. Okay. All right. Since you guys say yes, I'll do it. I'll do the third one, yes.
And now you know why I didn't want to go after him when he read.
And your books? Have you participated?
In the Audible? Yes. Audiobooks? Yes. So I am a huge audiobook listener. Going back to the whole mom thing, I usually drive I think 3 to 4 hours a day because my kids are in everything. And so I listen to a lot of audiobooks. So I have my personal favorites. And when I first received the list of narrators that I wanted to consider, they said, or you can suggest somebody else. And I happen to be a huge Saskia Marleveld fan. And so I said, I felt like asking for Saskia Marleveld was kind of like asking for Jennifer Aniston to play me in a live movie. And I really did not think she was going to say yes. And they came back almost immediately and she said yes. And I think they could hear me screaming all the way in New York because I was so excited. And she's just lovely and she's just done such an exquisite job. So I'm so lucky.
Yeah, and I've been lucky enough to be able to choose the narrator for each book, and usually there's 2 narrators. And I have to say, the people at Dutton and Penguin Random House do a great job of producing the audio. They come to us and will ask for, okay, how do you want this word pronounced, or what kind of accent do you want for this person? And then they just go and create such an amazing world of its own. It's really a wonderful, wonderful gift.
In doing research for this, I watched a number of interviews in various forms. Brendan, you have a podcast. Would you like to talk about your podcast a bit?
I do. My podcast is called, I should say, and I'm going to do this, I apologize, shameless, my award-winning podcast. I got an award for a Creative Muse Award for it, and it's called How Music Can Save Your Life. And I'm so passionate about music and its life-saving properties. I really, really am. I've had the opportunity to interview jazz musicians, rock musicians, classical musicians, conductors, pianists, bassoonists, guitar, everybody, violinists. My first interview is with a jazz violinist named Ken Ford, and it is incredible all of the stories that we have that are so similar, and we all have the same themes. We started off one way, music came into our lives, and it changed our lives for the better. Music this is my shameless plug for music. It is the only thing that you can go across the world, not speak the language, and have an instant connection with someone. Music is a life-saving force. Support your local school music programs.
With some communication ahead of time, I was relaying that we have a very wonderful town of not only appreciation for musical art, but for reading and literacy and the joy of books, as you see here. I also shared with Brendan that we had very famous Hilary Hahn here since she was 12 years old. We had Joshua Bell at the Lyric. We also had Itzhak Perlman, and the only American to ever win the competition that is referred to in the book actually lives here in Stewart, which was a surprise to find out. I have a question. It's rather a philosophical one, and that is, we know what the story is of your book. What is the message?
I'll go first. For me, there's 2 models in the book. There's Lillian in the 1919s, and then in the 60s, there's Veronica. And both women, for me, the crux of the story is, what's the difference between being looked at or between being seen? What is the difference between those two? And really figuring out, especially as these women in the past who are judged by their looks, sometimes very harshly, when is it that it's the person deep down inside that counts? And who are the people who are looking at you in that way, that they see that person that's deeper down and more complex than just the exterior?
Either one of you.
Please.
For the librarian spy, the message of the book is really that words have power. First, we have Ava, who is gathering these pamphlets and sending them back to America for them to assess to see what sort of value they can find to get detailed information about the Nazis to defeat them. And then as far as Elaine goes, with working with the printing press, the words that they publish have so much power. These are the words that are able to sway the tides of war, that are able to draw people into the French resistance, that are able to stop the spread of disinformation that the Germans are trying to put out there to really just completely damage the morale of the French people. So having that even though they don't have weapons to fight against them, they have words, and words are so powerful.
Really two messages. One, do what you love to do because you love it. Don't ever let someone tell you you can't, ever. Absolutely. And never, ever, ever give up. Ever. Never give up.
Well, thank you very much for that. I wondered, as we said, the words are on the pages and we can all read them, but there's heart and life and drive in what comes through the books. And I was curious to know what was your driving force on that. Have a couple more questions from the audience. We have just a minute or two. And that is, would you talk a little bit about your nonprofit, which with the music for children?
My nonprofit is called Hands Across the Sea, and it's based in the Philippines. I did a tour of the Philippines back in the early 2000s, and the conditions over there were just unbelievable. And even though the conditions were so bad, the people were so happy. They were so spiritually happy. And I gave 35 American dollars to someone that I'd met over there who was really, really nice. With that money, 35 bucks. They built an extra room onto their house. 12 people were living in one room. He could move his family into the extra part of the house with $35. I said, what could 50 do? What could 100 do? What could 1,000 do? So I started collecting money for my friends. I stopped buying a new pair of shoes every month, and I would go over to the Philippines once a year, take money, and buy supplies. What do you need? We need this. We need reeds. We need strings. We need toothbrushes. We need this. And I would buy it and have money left over. And it's just, I'm trying to help people who can't help themselves, because at some point we're all going to need a hand.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say that there happens to be a question here regarding, it's a technical question that I'm sure you can answer, but perhaps in that room over there, which is talk about the different types of bows and the change in the sound from your violin. I am aware that there are music teachers and music students in the room and the audience today who came specifically just to hear you talk about the violin.
I know what this is. This is a test. You guys don't believe it, do you? That's what it is. Yeah, I got you guys. Now, are you talking a Baroque bow or a standard violin bow? What do we see? I know my terms. Your Baroque bow is a little bit shorter. And the resistance is a lot different than a standard bow, where you can, with the frog, you can actually loosen and tighten the strings. And you're going to get a different sound. A Baroque instrument is going to be a little bit softer, and it has a flatter bridge, so you can play double stops a lot easier. Wow, Brenda knows what he's talking about. Yeah.
I mean, I was convinced.
Yeah. Tell us what's next for you. What's your next book? When's it coming out?
Yeah, my next book comes out June 13th. It's called The Spectacular. And it came about when I got an email through my author website, and a woman said, I'm in my 80s, I'm a former Rockette, and if you want to know the secrets of Radio City, you should call me. So I had to do that. And so I called. She was amazing. We had a great conversation. I went on to interview a number of women who danced at Radio City in the 50s and 60s, and created a book based on that. It's about a woman who kind of defies her family's wishes to become a Rockette, and she also gets caught up in a hunt for a bomber who's been targeting iconic New York City buildings. And that's based on an actual bomber named the Mad Bomber, who terrorized New York for 16 years, setting bombs all over, and no one remembers this. And so I kind of pulled those two stories together. So it's a backstage look at Radio City, which is really fun, and then also a bit of a thriller aspect on the hunt to find the killer.
That is awesome.
It's fun.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read that book.
I know, that sounds really good. My next book is called The Keeper of Hidden Books, and it's set in Warsaw, Poland during World War II. and it is based on the true stories of the Warsaw public librarians during that time, trying to, basically when the Nazis came in, they were trying to remove all Polish culture. So they were pulping books, they were completely shutting down libraries, museums. So these are the secret libraries that operated inside and out of the ghetto, and also trying to save all of these books. And it comes out on August 1st, which is a really big deal because August 1st was the day of the Warsaw Uprising. And to this day, at 5 p.m. on August 1st, all of Warsaw goes quiet, except for all of the horns and sirens that are blaring all throughout the city in celebration of the Warsaw Uprising, even to this day.
My next book is called Symphony of Secrets, and it comes out April 18th. I'm really excited about this book. It deals with dual timelines, one set in the 1920s Jazz Age New York and one in modern day. It involves a neurodivergent composer who meets another composer, and it's like, which one of them is the real genius behind all of this music? And in the present day, Bern Hendricks, who is actually based on my late brother, is putting everything together, discovering the secrets, and trying to outrun a major corporation that is trying to silence him. Symphony of Secrets.
We can't wait to read them all. It has been wonderful to meet these authors and to do the research on them over the past few months. It's a privilege to have them here in our town and to greet them as warmly as you have. I can't thank you enough. They will be across the hall for signing of their books, and we hope that you'll flood the room and have your books signed. But before you do that, please don't go. Sue's going to close out the event, but please give a warm round for my authors.
And for Paula.
What an amazing day. And I want to give a big thank you to all of the people who are volunteering, library staff and the volunteers. I moved here in 1999, and the very first thing I did was get my library card. And they identified me as fresh meat. And I ended up volunteering the next week, and I haven't stopped since. So let's please support our wonderful libraries and keep them being centers of our community. On behalf of the Library Foundation of Martin County and the Martin County Library System, on behalf of all of the authors and for all of the people who read, thank you for being here and being part of this year's BookMania, and for the many ways you support our library system. Do you think we should do this again next year? Okay, we'll go across the hall, buy some books, keep reading, tell your friends about this, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Thank you, Sue, very much for moderating today for the whole event. Thank you.